Hello there. Welcome to a gentle journey back through time to the shimmering shores of ancient Alexandria, where the Mediterranean's waves once caressed one of humanity's greatest maritime wonders. If you find comfort in these historical whispers, I'd be so grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video and perhaps subscribe if these quiet explorations of the past bring you peace. I'm always curious to know where in our wide world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Perhaps you're settling in for sleep as twilight falls, or maybe these words are finding you in the stillness of early morning. Whatever the hour, I hope you'll share your location and time in the comments below as we create this gentle community of listeners across time and space. As you close your eyes and prepare to drift, can you imagine what it might have felt like to sail into Alexandria's legendary harbor 2,000 years ago? The magnificent Pharos lighthouse guiding your way through the gathering dusk, the scent of distant spices carried on the sea breeze, and the soft murmur of countless languages mingling in the air of what was once the crossroads of the ancient world. The question of what it might have felt like to sail into Alexandria's harbor is one that has captivated historians and dreamers alike for centuries. The journey begins long before the ship's arrival, as sailors peering anxiously from their wooden vessels would first glimpse a miraculous sight rising from the horizon. A tower of impossibly white stone, reaching toward the heavens, crowned by an eternal flame that could be seen from nearly 30 miles out to sea. This was the legendary Pharos lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and for many travelers, their first glimpse of its soaring form meant the difference between life and death upon the often treacherous Mediterranean waters. The very conception of such a structure feels like something from a dream, doesn't it? Picture the scene on the small limestone island of Pharos around 297 BCE, as workers gathered under the warm Egyptian sun to begin a project that would defy imagination. The visionary behind this wonder was Ptolemy of Soter, one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals who had claimed Egypt as his kingdom following Alexander's untimely death. Ptolemy understood something fundamental about his newly founded city of Alexandria, that its prosperity would depend entirely upon safe passage for merchant ships navigating the challenging coastline. The northern shores of Egypt offered few natural harbors, and Alexandria's position, though strategically valuable, presented real dangers to approaching vessels. The site chosen for the lighthouse was perfect in its imperfection, if you can imagine such a paradox. The small island of Pharos sat just offshore from the mainland, creating a natural breakwater that formed 2 distinct harbors, the Great Harbor to the east, and the Eunostos or Harbor of Safe Return to the west. Yet the approaches to these harbors were treacherous, with submerged reefs and shifting sandbanks lying in wait to claim unwary ships. The need for a beacon was clear, but Ptolemy and his architects envisioned something far beyond a simple fire on a hill. They dreamed of a structure so tall and magnificent that it would not only guide ships safely to port, but would also stand as a testament to Alexandria's greatness, visible to all who approached from the sea. The architect chosen for this monumental task was Sostratus of Cnidus, a Greek engineer whose name would become immortalized through his creation. We can imagine him walking the rocky shores of Pharos Island, measuring the play of wind and waves, calculating angles of visibility from far out to sea, and sketching plans in the sand as he contemplated the enormous challenge before him. The lighthouse would need to withstand not just the test of time, but the constant assault of salt spray, wind, and occasional earthquakes that troubled the region. It would need to be tall enough to be seen from far offshore, yet stable enough to endure for generations. The construction methods employed were nothing short of revolutionary for their time. Workers began by laying a foundation of massive stone blocks, creating a solid base upon which the soaring tower could safely stand. Some historical accounts suggest that molten lead was poured between these blocks to seal them against the corrosive seawater, while others indicate that the stones were so precisely cut that they fit together almost perfectly without mortar. Can you imagine the patience and skill required to shape each massive stone, some weighing many tons, with such precision using only simple tools and manual labor? The sound of chisels tapping against limestone would have filled the air from dawn until dusk, a rhythmic accompaniment to the constant crash of waves against the shore. The tower itself rose in 3 distinct sections, each with its own purpose and character. The lowest level was square in shape, forming a massive base approximately 100 feet on each side and rising nearly 200 feet into the air. This section contained storage rooms, quarters for the lighthouse keepers, and a spiraling ramp that allowed animals to carry fuel to the upper levels. I find it wonderfully human that even in constructing one of the ancient world's most remarkable structures, practical considerations like how to transport heavy bundles of wood upward were carefully addressed. Can you picture the steady procession of donkeys plodding up the internal ramp, laden with wood that would feed the great fire at the summit? Above this square base rose the second section, an octagonal tower, perhaps another 100 feet in height. This middle section likely contained additional rooms for the lighthouse keepers, and storage for the precious fuels that would keep the beacon burning through countless nights. The transition from square to octagonal was not merely aesthetic, but served an engineering purpose, helping to distribute the weight and stress of the structure more evenly while reducing the wind resistance of the upper portions. There's something quite poetic in this marriage of beauty and function, don't you think? The lighthouse was becoming gradually more refined as it reached toward the heavens, shedding its earthbound solidity for a more ethereal form. The third and final section was cylindrical, tapering gently as it rose another 100 feet or more, culminating in an open platform where the actual beacon burned. This beacon was no ordinary fire. Historical accounts suggest that a complex system of mirrors, likely made of polished bronze, was arranged to amplify the light and project it far out to sea. Some ancient writers even claimed that these mirrors could focus the sun's rays to set enemy ships ablaze, though modern historians tend to view such tales as fanciful exaggerations. More reliable accounts tell us that during daylight hours, massive mirrors would reflect the sun to create a bright signal visible to ships, while at night a great fire burned, its light magnified and directed outward by the clever arrangement of reflective surfaces. Crowning the entire structure was a statue, most likely of Poseidon, god of the sea, or perhaps Zeus, king of the gods, standing as a silent guardian over all who sought Alexandria's harbors. The total height of the completed lighthouse is thought to have been between 380 and 450 feet, a truly staggering achievement for ancient engineers, working without modern equipment or materials. To put this in perspective, it would remain one of the tallest man-made structures in the world for many centuries, not surpassed until the great medieval cathedrals began to rise across Europe, nearly a millennium later. The construction of this wonder took approximately 12 years, spanning the reigns of both Ptolemy I and his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who would ultimately complete and dedicate the structure around 285 BCE. One charming historical anecdote tells us that Sostratus, the architect, was so proud of his creation that he carved an inscription into the stone. Sostratus, of Cnidus, son of Dexiphanes, dedicated this to the saviour gods, on behalf of all mariners. Then, cleverly, he covered this inscription with plaster, on which was written a dedication to Ptolemy. Sostratus knew that eventually the plaster would wear away, revealing his name to future generations long after the king was gone. Whether this tale is true, or merely a legend, it speaks to the very human desire to be remembered, to leave one's mark upon the world. The completion of the lighthouse transformed Alexandria's harbors from potentially dangerous maritime approaches into one of the ancient world's safest and most welcoming ports. Ships from across the Mediterranean could now navigate confidently toward the city, guided by the steadfast beacon that burned night after night, year after year, century after century. The Pharos became not just a practical aid to navigation, but a symbol of Alexandria itself, so much so that lighthouses around the world would come to be known by the name Pharos in many languages. The structure appeared on coins, in artwork and in literature, becoming as recognizable a symbol of the city as the Great Library or the Royal Palace complex. For sailors approaching Alexandria, after weeks at sea, the first glimpse of the Pharos on the horizon must have brought an overwhelming sense of relief and wonder. As their vessels drew closer to shore, the magnificent harbour would gradually reveal itself, a bustling scene of maritime activity, unlike any other in the ancient world. Ships of all sizes from every corner of the known world would crowd the waters, their colourful sails furled as they manoeuvred toward assigned berths. The The sounds of shouted commands in dozens of languages, the creaking of wooden hulls, and the splash of anchor chains dropping into the water would create a symphony of commerce and connection that defined Alexandria's special place in the ancient world. The engineering achievements that made the Pharos lighthouse possible were nothing short of miraculous for their time. As we continue our gentle journey through Alexandria's ancient maritime world, let's explore the remarkable technical innovations that allowed this wonder to stand against time and tide for over 1,000 years. The construction of such a massive structure so close to the sea presented challenges that would daunt even modern engineers, yet the ancient builders overcame them with ingenuity and patience that still inspires awe today. Can you imagine the courage it must have taken to even conceive of such an ambitious project, let alone to see it through to completion? The first challenge facing Sostratus and his team was the foundation. Building on the rocky island of Pharos meant contending with the constant erosion of waves and the possibility of earthquake damage. The solution they devised was brilliant in its simplicity. They created a massive platform of limestone blocks set directly into the bedrock of the island. Recent archaeological investigations have revealed that these foundation stones were cut with astonishing precision and fitted together without mortar in many places. Their immense weight and perfect fit, creating a stable base that could withstand both the constant pressure of the structure above and the relentless action of the sea below. Some of these foundation blocks weighed upwards of 75 tons. Try to imagine, if you will, the immense effort required to quarry, transport and position such massive pieces of stone using only human and animal power, wooden rollers, and simple pulley systems. The stone itself came primarily from quarries near Alexandria, though some specialized materials may have been imported from further afield. Limestone formed the bulk of the structure, chosen for its relative abundance in the region and its proven durability in building. However, the lighthouse wasn't constructed entirely of stone. Ancient accounts tell us that the interior contained wooden elements that provided both structural support and formed the famous ramp that wound its way up through the lower levels. This combination of materials required a sophisticated understanding of their different properties, how they would interact, how they would age, and how they would respond to the stresses of wind and weather. The actual construction process was a marvel of organization and engineering. Imagine hundreds of workers laboring in coordinated teams, stone cutters shaping each block with meticulous care, teams of men and oxen hauling the finished pieces to the building site, engineers calculating the precise position of each stone, and skilled masons ensuring perfect alignment as each course was laid. The blocks were likely raised using a combination of earthen ramps and crane-like devices powered by large treadwheels, which teams of men would walk inside to generate lifting power. These ancient cranes, described by Roman architect Vitruvius, could lift surprising weights when operated by skilled teams. One of the most fascinating aspects of the lighthouse's construction was the internal structure. Within the massive stone shell ran a complex network of rooms, corridors, and the central ramp that allowed access to the upper levels. Unlike the simple solid towers we might imagine, the Pharos was essentially a building within a building, a sturdy outer shell, containing a complex internal architecture. This design served multiple purposes. It reduced the overall weight of the structure, provided necessary space for the lighthouse keepers and their supplies, and created the pathway by which fuel could be transported to the beacon at the top. The central ramp deserves special attention, as it represents one of the lighthouse's most innovative features. Rather than using stairs, which would have made the transport of heavy fuel extremely difficult, the architects designed a gently sloping ramp wide enough for animals to ascend while carrying loads of wood. This ramp spiraled upward through the square base of the tower, making approximately 8 complete turns before reaching the second level. Imagine the thoughtful consideration that went into this design. The architects understood that the lighthouse would need to be refueled daily for centuries to come, and they created a solution that would make this essential task as efficient as possible. Lighting the beacon itself presented another set of complex engineering challenges. The ancient world had no electricity, of course, so maintaining a bright, consistent light required considerable ingenuity. The fuel was likely olive oil in the earliest periods, perhaps later supplemented with other combustible materials. The light chamber at the top of the tower would have contained a sophisticated system for burning this fuel efficiently, while protecting the flame from wind and rain. Historical accounts suggest that the famous mirrors were arranged in a parabolic shape behind the flame. These mirrors represent perhaps the most advanced technology employed in the entire structure, made of highly polished metal, likely bronze, rather than actual glass, which was extremely rare and precious in the ancient world. They required exceptional craftsmanship to create and maintain. The saltwater environment would have caused rapid corrosion of the metal surfaces, necessitating regular polishing and occasional replacement. We can picture the lighthouse keepers as not just tenders of the flame, but skilled metal workers in their own right, constantly battling the elements to keep the mirrors bright and functional. The upper portions of the lighthouse presented their own unique engineering challenges. As the tower narrowed toward its peak, the builders had to ensure that it remained stable against the often powerful winds that swept in from the Mediterranean. The transition from the square base to the octagonal middle section, and finally to the cylindrical upper portion, wasn't merely aesthetic, it represented a sophisticated understanding of aerodynamics. The octagonal midsection provided a transition that helped reduce wind resistance while maintaining structural integrity, while the cylindrical upper section presented the smallest possible surface area to the force of the wind. The crowning element of the lighthouse was the statue that stood atop the entire structure. While we don't know with certainty which deity it depicted, we do know that securing a large metal statue at such a height, exposed to the elements, would have required careful engineering. The statue was likely anchored to the stone platform, with bronze pins set deeply into the masonry, and it may have been designed with its exposure to wind in mind, perhaps with small openings that would allow air to pass through rather than creating a solid surface that could catch the full force of a storm. One of the most remarkable achievements of the lighthouse's engineers was its durability. While most ancient structures were built with a lifespan of decades or perhaps a few centuries in mind, the Pharos continued to function for well over a millennium. It survived countless storms, several significant earthquakes, and the gradual transition of Egypt from Ptolemaic rule through Roman occupation and into the Islamic period. This extraordinary longevity speaks to the quality of the original construction and the ongoing maintenance that successive generations committed to this essential navigation aid. The lighthouse required constant attention to remain functional. A team of keepers would have lived within the structure itself, responsible for maintaining the flame, polishing the mirrors, repairing weather damage, and keeping the internal ramp clear for the daily transport of fuel. These unnamed individuals, whose diligent work kept the light burning night after night, year after year, are the unsung heroes of the Pharos story. While we celebrate the architect Sostratus and the Ptolemaic rulers who commissioned the structure, it was these lighthouse keepers whose dedicated service truly made the Pharos a functioning wonder, rather than merely an impressive monument. The engineering of the Pharos influenced lighthouse construction for centuries to come. Its three-tiered design, with a square base, octagonal midsection, and cylindrical upper portion, established a pattern that would be replicated in lighthouses throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Even the name Pharos became synonymous with lighthouses in many languages. In Italian Faro, in French Phare, in Spanish Faro, a linguistic legacy that continues to this day, keeping the memory of Alexandria's wonder alive in everyday speech. What makes the engineering of the Pharos particularly impressive is that it was accomplished without the benefit of modern materials like concrete, steel, or precision-cut stone. The ancient builders relied on a deep understanding of materials, careful observation of natural principles, and extraordinary patience and skill to create a structure that would have been challenging even with modern technology. Their achievement stands as testimony to human ingenuity and determination, a reminder that remarkable things are possible even with limited tools when coupled with imagination and persistence. As we imagine the completed lighthouse standing proud against the Mediterranean sky, it's worth considering the psychological impact it must have had on those who saw it. For approaching sailors, it represented safety and the promise of rest after long voyages. For Alexandria's citizens, it was a source of civic pride and a daily reminder of their city's importance. For visitors, It was an awe-inspiring demonstration of human capability, a structure that seemed to defy the natural limitations of stone and human muscle. The Pharos wasn't merely functional, it inspired wonder, and in doing so, it fulfilled one of architecture's highest purposes. The technical achievements embodied in the Pharos lighthouse represent the culmination of knowledge gathered across multiple civilizations. Egyptian expertise in working with massive stone blocks, Greek innovations in geometry and proportion, and Levantine traditions of maritime construction all came together in this remarkable structure. Alexandria itself, as a crossroads of cultures, was the perfect location for such a synthesis of knowledge, a place where different traditions could merge to create something greater than any could have achieved alone. The lighthouse stands as a physical embodiment of the cultural exchange that made Alexandria the intellectual capital of the ancient world. As the soft Mediterranean waters lap against Alexandria's modern shoreline, they hold secrets from another time, preserved in the silent depths below. The ancient harbor that once welcomed ships from across the known world now lies partially submerged, a submarine museum of extraordinary archaeological importance. Let's descend together beneath the surface of these azure waters and explore what remains of the maritime heart of Ptolemaic Alexandria, guided by the remarkable discoveries of underwater archaeologists who have, over recent decades, literally illuminated this submerged landscape. The story of how Alexandria's ancient harbor came to rest beneath the waves is one of both dramatic geological events and the subtle, persistent forces of nature. The northern coast of Egypt has experienced significant subsidence over the millennia, a gradual sinking of the land that has caused sections of the ancient city to slip beneath the Mediterranean surface. This process was accelerated by a series of catastrophic earthquakes, particularly those that struck in the 4th and 8th centuries CE, which damaged many of Alexandria's iconic structures, including portions of the Pharos lighthouse and harbor installations. Can you imagine the terror of those moments, as the earth trembled and massive stone structures that had stood for centuries began to crumble and slip into the waiting sea? The underwater exploration of Alexandria's harbor began in earnest in the early 1960s, when a team led by the pioneering underwater archaeologist Honor Frost conducted preliminary surveys of the area. What they found was tantalizing, clear evidence of ancient structures lying just below the surface of the water. But it wasn't until the 1990s that a comprehensive effort to map and excavate these submerged ruins began, led by the French archaeologist Jean-Yves Empereur, and later joined by Franck Godillot's team. These modern explorers faced challenges that their terrestrial colleagues could scarcely imagine, working in an environment where visibility was often limited, where currents could suddenly shift, and where every artifact recovered required specialized conservation techniques to prevent deterioration after centuries of immersion in salt water. The most spectacular discoveries came from the eastern harbor, once the great harbor of Alexandria, where the waters yielded thousands of architectural elements, statues, and everyday objects. Imagine the moment when divers first glimpsed the colossal statue of a Ptolemaic queen, lying on her side in the silty harbor bottom, her serene face gazing out at nothing for 2 millennia, or the thrill of recognition when massive blocks were identified as having once formed part of the Pharos lighthouse itself, scattered across the seabed like discarded toys of giants, still bearing the marks of their careful shaping by ancient stonecutters. The underwater excavations revealed that the ancient harbor was far more complex and sophisticated than previously imagined. The entrance was protected by an elaborate system of moles and breakwaters, creating a sheltered basin that could accommodate hundreds of vessels simultaneously. These harbor works weren't simple piled stone structures, but carefully engineered installations that incorporated specialized elements like mooring rings and bollards for securing ships of various sizes. The harbor bottom itself was dredged regularly to maintain sufficient depth for the larger merchant vessels, evidence of the ongoing maintenance that any busy port requires. Perhaps the most poignant discoveries were the everyday objects that spoke of the harbor's busy commercial life. Ceramic amphorae that once contained wine, oil, or grain, lid anchor stocks from merchant ships, fishing equipment that had slipped from ancient hands into the harbor waters. Each of these humble artifacts tells a story of daily life in this bustling port, connecting us directly to the sailors, stevedores, merchants, and fishermen who once made their living along these shores. There's something deeply moving about holding an object last touched by human hands thousands of years ago, isn't there? A simple clay oil lamp recovered from the harbor mud might have illuminated the face of a sailor writing a letter home, or a merchant calculating the day's profits, or a fisherman mending nets by its flickering light. The underwater archaeological work has also revealed tantalizing details about the ships themselves that once crowded Alexandria's harbor. While few intact vessels have been found in the harbor proper, they would likely have been salvaged if they sank in such shallow waters. Numerous pieces of ship timbers, lead sheathing, and other nautical elements have helped archaeologists reconstruct the types of vessels that once sailed these waters. They ranged from small fishing boats and harbor lighters to massive grain ships capable of carrying hundreds of tons of Egyptian wheat to feed the hungry populations of Rome and other Mediterranean cities. Alexandria's harbor was essentially the shipping terminal for Egypt's agricultural bounty, the point where the rich harvests of the Nile Valley were transferred to seagoing vessels for distribution throughout the ancient world. One of the most fascinating aspects of the underwater discoveries has been what they reveal about ancient harbor technology. The Greeks and Romans were master harbor engineers, and Alexandria showcased some of their most advanced techniques. Excavations have uncovered sophisticated quays, built of massive limestone blocks, with stairs leading down to landing stages where smaller boats could load and unload passengers and cargo. Special ramps facilitated the movement of heavy goods from ship to shore, while warehouses lined the waterfront, ready to receive valuable imports or store exports awaiting shipment. Underwater archaeologists have even identified what appear to be ancient dry docks, specially constructed basins where ships could be hauled out of the water for maintenance and repairs. The submerged ruins also tell us much about how the harbor changed over time, adapting to the needs of different eras. The original Ptolemaic installations were modified during the Roman period, with new quays and facilities added to accommodate the increased maritime traffic that came with Egypt's incorporation into the Roman Empire. Later Byzantine adaptations reflected the changing political and economic conditions of the Eastern Mediterranean, while architectural elements from the early Islamic period demonstrate the harbor's continued importance, even as Alexandria's prominence gradually declined relative to new ports like Cairo's harbor on the Nile. One of the most remarkable discoveries in Alexandria's underwater landscape was the identification of remains from the royal quarter that once graced the eastern harbor. The Ptolemaic rulers built their palaces along the waterfront, creating a spectacular architectural showcase that would be the first thing visitors saw as they sailed into the great harbor. These structures extended out into the harbor itself on artificially created peninsulas and islands, blending land and sea in a display of engineering prowess and royal ostentation. Underwater excavations have recovered magnificent architectural elements from these palaces, columns of imported granite and marble, intricately carved cornices, and mosaic pavements of astonishing beauty and complexity. The harbor waters have also yielded evidence of the religious life that was interwoven with maritime activities in the ancient world. Votive offerings to gods associated with the sea, particularly Isis Pharia, Isis of the Lighthouse, have been recovered from what appear to be underwater shrine locations. Sailors embarking on dangerous voyages would make offerings seeking divine protection, while those who had survived perilous journeys would leave tokens of gratitude. These sacred objects, small statues, specialized vessels, inscribed plaques, create a touching connection to the hopes and fears of those who made their living on the unpredictable Mediterranean waters. The underwater excavations have changed our understanding not just of Alexandria's harbor, but of ancient harbor construction more generally. The discoveries have demonstrated that Hellenistic and Roman engineers had mastered sophisticated techniques for creating artificial harbors, including the use of hydraulic concrete that could set underwater. This specialized material, made with volcanic ash that reacted chemically with seawater, allowed for the construction of moles, breakwaters and quays directly in the sea, a technology that wouldn't be rediscovered until the modern era. The scale and complexity of Alexandria's harbor works suggest that they were planned and executed by specialists with deep knowledge of maritime engineering, perhaps drawing on expertise developed in other major Mediterranean ports. The preservation conditions underwater have been both a blessing and a challenge for archaeologists. On one hand, the underwater environment has protected many artifacts from the deterioration and looting that often affect land sites. Objects made of organic materials like wood, leather, and fabric, which rarely survive in terrestrial contexts in Egypt's climate, have sometimes been preserved in the oxygen-poor sediments of the harbour bottom. On the other hand, the marine environment introduces its own forms of damage. Salt water degrades many materials over time, marine organisms bore into wood and even stone, and the constant movement of water can abrade surfaces and scatter assemblages of artifacts that might otherwise provide valuable contextual information. Exploring this submerged world requires specialized techniques and equipment that have evolved significantly since the early days of underwater archaeology. Modern excavators use GPS and sonar mapping to create detailed three-dimensional models of the harbour bottom, identifying anomalies that might represent archaeological features before divers even enter the water. Underwater photography and videography, with specialized lighting equipment, allow for detailed documentation of finds in situ, while vacuum dredges, essentially underwater vacuum cleaners, permit the careful removal of sediments covering delicate artifacts. Conservation begins the moment an object is recovered, with specialized treatments required to prevent deterioration as artifacts transition from their stable underwater environment to exposure to air. The underwater archaeological work in Alexandria's harbour continues to this day, with new discoveries regularly emerging from the silty depths. Each field season adds pieces to our understanding of this complex maritime landscape, helping us to reconstruct not just the physical environment of the ancient harbour, but the activities, connections, and daily lives that animated it. The harbour was Alexandria's gateway to the world, the mechanism by which ideas, goods, and people flowed into and out of this cosmopolitan centre. By recovering its physical remains, archaeologists are helping to recover the stories of countless individuals whose lives intersected with these waters. From the royal figures who commissioned monumental structures to the anonymous sailors, fishermen, and dock workers, whose labour kept the harbour functioning day after day, year after year. As we imagine this submerged landscape, we might wonder what future discoveries still await in the depths of Alexandria's harbour. What ships might lie buried in deeper sediments, their cargoes intact? What texts might have been sealed in waterproof containers, preserving knowledge thought lost to humanity? What personal possessions might connect us directly to individuals who walked these quays when they still stood in the open air? The waters hold their secrets patiently, waiting for archaeologists with the right techniques and questions to reveal them. In this underwater realm, the past isn't really past. It's simply waiting to be rediscovered, one careful excavation at a time. Among the most evocative discoveries beneath Alexandria's waters are the remains of what many archaeologists believe to be portions of Cleopatra VII's royal palace complex. As we continue our gentle journey through time, let's explore these submerged ruins that once housed the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a woman whose name has echoed through history as a symbol of both political acumen and doomed romance. The palace that now lies beneath the waves was once the center of power for a queen who nearly changed the course of Mediterranean history, and its sunken remains offer tantalizing glimpses into her world of luxury, diplomacy, and strategic ambition. The royal quarter of Alexandria occupied the northeastern portion of the city, extending along the curve of the Great Harbour, and out onto a peninsula known as Audacious. This was prime real estate in the ancient city, offering spectacular views across the harbour to the Pharos lighthouse and the open Mediterranean beyond. The Ptolemaic rulers had developed this area over generations, creating an interconnected complex of palaces, gardens, administrative buildings, and private harbours that served as both the seat of government and their personal residence. By Cleopatra's time, the royal quarter covered a substantial area, perhaps as much as a third of the entire city, and represented the accumulated architectural ambitions of 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule. Underwater explorations have revealed foundations, architectural fragments, and statuary that once formed part of this magnificent complex. Imagine diving down through the clear blue waters and suddenly seeing massive granite columns lying on the seabed, their surfaces still bearing the marks of ancient chisels. Or picture the moment of discovery, as archaeologists brushed away sediment to reveal a colossal statue of a Ptolemaic queen, perhaps Cleopatra herself, her serene face, gazing upward through the shifting underwater light. These fragments, scattered by earthquakes and coastal subsidence, are like pieces of an enormous three-dimensional puzzle that archaeologists are slowly piecing together to reconstruct the appearance of the royal quarter. The underwater evidence suggests that the royal palace complex was built on a truly lavish scale, befitting the immense wealth of Ptolemaic Egypt. The buildings were constructed of the finest materials available in the ancient world: red granite from Aswan, marble from Greece and Italy, alabaster from Egypt's eastern deserts. Columns rose in forests of stone, supporting roofs decorated with gilded coffers and painted scenes. Floors were paved with intricate mosaics depicting mythological scenes, geometric patterns, or the abundant wildlife of the Nile Valley. The walls were likely adorned with frescoes in the Greek style, perhaps showing scenes from mythology or portraits of the royal family. Every element was designed to impress visitors with the wealth, culture, and power of the Ptolemaic dynasty. One particularly fascinating aspect of the submerged palace complex is the evidence for artificial extensions of the land into the harbour. The Ptolemies literally reshaped the coastline to create their royal quarter, building out into the water on massive stone foundations to create new land where they could construct gardens, pavilions, and private harbours. These ambitious engineering projects demonstrate both the technical capabilities of Hellenistic architects and the virtually unlimited resources at the disposal of Egypt's rulers. The ability to reshape the very boundary between land and sea was a powerful symbol of royal authority, a demonstration that even nature itself could be made to conform to the monarch's will. Cleopatra's palace would have included numerous specialized spaces serving different functions within the royal household and government. Audience chambers where the queen received foreign ambassadors and conducted official business would have been designed to maximize the impression of royal power and dignity. Dining rooms for state banquets would have showcased the luxury and refinement of the Ptolemaic court, while private apartments provided spaces for the queen and her closest associates to retreat from the demands of public life. Libraries held collections of scrolls on subjects ranging from literature and philosophy to history and natural science, reflecting the Ptolemies' long-standing patronage of intellectual pursuits. The palace complex also included gardens that were renowned throughout the ancient Mediterranean. These weren't simply decorative spaces, but carefully designed landscapes that combined aesthetic beauty with symbolic meaning. Plants from across Egypt and beyond were gathered in these royal gardens, creating living collections that demonstrated the reach of Ptolemaic influence and trade networks. Fountains and pools provided cooling effects in Alexandria's warm climate, while carefully planned vistas offered dramatic views of the harbour, the Pharos lighthouse, and the endless expanse of the Mediterranean. These gardens would have been settings for intimate gatherings, philosophical discussions, and perhaps romantic encounters, including, we might imagine, meetings between Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, or Mark Antony, during their famous relationships with the Egyptian queen. One of the most intriguing features of the royal quarter was the private harbour that served the palace complex. Separate from the main commercial harbour, this royal port allowed the queen and her court to arrive and depart by sea, avoiding the crowded streets of the city. It also provided secure docking for royal vessels, including the famously luxurious ships that Cleopatra used for both practical travel and ceremonial purposes. Underwater archaeologists have identified structures that may have been part of this private harbour: specialized quays, breakwaters, and even what appear to be the foundations of a small lighthouse or signal tower that would have guided vessels safely to the royal docks. The most spectacular of Cleopatra's ships was undoubtedly the vessel described by ancient writers as her golden barge, an enormous floating palace, used for her famous journey up the Nile to meet Mark Antony. While this particular ship would have been too large to dock in the palace harbour, the royal fleet certainly included smaller but no less luxurious vessels for the queen's use around Alexandria. These royal ships were floating extensions of the palace itself, equipped with dining facilities, comfortable accommodations, and even small gardens in planter boxes. They represented the seamless integration of maritime and royal culture that characterized Alexandria under the Ptolemies. Life in Cleopatra's palace complex would have been a daily pageant of luxury, ceremony, and intrigue. The queen would have been surrounded by a substantial household staff, servants, guards, administrators, tutors for the royal children, and specialists in everything from cuisine to cosmetics. Foreign visitors from across the Mediterranean world would have moved through designated public areas, while access to more private spaces was carefully controlled. The daily operations of government took place alongside the domestic routines of the royal family, with messengers constantly coming and going, carrying communications to and from all parts of Egypt and beyond. Cleopatra herself was far more than the seductress portrayed in later Roman propaganda and Hollywood films. She was a skilled ruler, fluent in multiple languages, the only Ptolemaic ruler who actually spoke Egyptian alongside Greek, and deeply involved in the governance of her kingdom. The palace was her base of operations for a sophisticated foreign policy aimed at preserving Egypt's independence in the face of Rome's growing power. Within these now submerged walls, she would have met with advisors, studied reports from across her kingdom, and formulated the strategies that kept Egypt wealthy and relatively autonomous longer than any other Hellenistic kingdom. The archaeological evidence suggests that the palace complex was repeatedly modified and expanded over time, with Cleopatra herself likely commissioning significant renovations during her reign. Some underwater discoveries appear to represent unfinished construction projects, perhaps interrupted by the political turmoil following her defeat by Octavian, later Emperor Augustus in 30 BCE. After Cleopatra's death and Egypt's incorporation into the Roman Empire, parts of the palace complex continued to serve as the residence for Roman governors, while other sections may have been repurposed or allowed to fall into disrepair as the center of power shifted to Roman priorities. The eventual submergence of the palace complex beneath the waters of the Mediterranean was a gradual process. Some sections may have been damaged and abandoned after the major earthquakes that struck Alexandria in the 4th and 8th centuries CE, while the gradual subsidence of the coastline slowly claimed other areas. By the medieval period, the once magnificent royal quarter was largely forgotten, its exact location lost to memory, as Alexandria itself diminished in size and importance. Only with modern underwater archaeology has this remarkable complex begun to re-emerge from the obscurity of time and tide. What makes these submerged ruins so poignant is their connection to one of history's most compelling figures. As we imagine these underwater structures in their original splendor, we can almost picture Cleopatra moving through the columned halls, receiving Roman visitors like Caesar and Antony, planning the defense of her kingdom, or simply enjoying the spectacular view of the harbor from the palace gardens. The queen who captured the imagination of the ancient world, and continues to fascinate us today, walked these now submerged floors, touched these scattered columns, and gazed upon these fallen statues when they stood proud and intact. The archaeological work on Cleopatra's palace complex continues, with each field season potentially yielding new discoveries that might change our understanding of this remarkable site. Underwater excavations are painstaking work, requiring specialized skills and equipment, but the rewards are extraordinary. Direct connections to one of history's most pivotal periods and most fascinating individuals. As technology continues to improve, allowing for more detailed surveys and more precise excavation techniques, we can expect our picture of Cleopatra's world to become increasingly clear and nuanced. For now, the palace of history's most famous Egyptian queen slumbers beneath the gentle Mediterranean waves, its scattered remains a reminder of power's impermanence and time's inexorable march. Yet, in these submerged stones and statues, Cleopatra's legacy endures, speaking to us across the millennia about ambition, culture, and the complex interplay of East and West that characterized her reign and continues to shape our world today. The waters that now cover her palace have, in their own way, preserved pieces of her story that might otherwise have been lost to time, waiting for modern explorers to rediscover and interpret them for a new age, equally captivated by the last queen of ancient Egypt. As we drift through our exploration of ancient Alexandria's harbor, Let's now turn our attention to the vast web of maritime connections that made this city the commercial crossroads of the ancient Mediterranean world. Long before modern concepts of globalization, Alexandria stood at the center of a complex network of sea routes that connected 3 continents, facilitating a remarkable exchange of goods, ideas, and peoples. The harbor we've been exploring was not merely a local port, but a crucial node in a transportation system that linked cultures and economies across thousands of miles, from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the Indian Ocean, from the Black Sea to the interior of Africa. The strategic position of Alexandria's harbor gave it natural advantages as a trading center. Situated at the western edge of the Nile Delta, it provided access to the agricultural wealth of Egypt's fertile valley, while facing outward toward the Mediterranean world. This dual orientation, looking both inward to Egypt and outward to the sea, made Alexandria the perfect interface between the ancient kingdom's abundant resources and the hungry markets of the Mediterranean basin. The city became, in essence, Egypt's window to the world, the point where the products of the Nile Valley were gathered, processed, and shipped to distant shores, and where foreign goods arrived to be distributed throughout the kingdom. The most important export flowing through Alexandria's harbor was grain. Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient Mediterranean, its reliable harvests providing a critical food source for less agriculturally blessed regions. The rich silt deposited by the annual Nile flood created extraordinarily fertile farmland that produced abundant wheat crops year after year. This grain was collected as tax from Egyptian farmers, transported down the Nile on river barges, and stored in massive warehouses along Alexandria's waterfront. From there it was loaded onto specialized grain ships, some of the largest vessels in the ancient world, for transport to Rome, Athens, and other Mediterranean cities. During the Roman period, the grain fleet from Alexandria was so essential to feeding Rome's huge population that it received special protection and privileges, its arrival each spring celebrated with public ceremonies and religious observances. Beyond grain, Egypt exported a remarkable range of other agricultural products through Alexandria's harbor. Papyrus, made from the pith of the papyrus plant that grew abundantly in the Nile Delta, was the ancient world's primary writing material, and Egypt held a near monopoly on its production. Dried fruits, particularly dates, were highly valued throughout the Mediterranean for their sweetness and long shelf life. Egyptian linen, made from flax grown along the Nile, was prized for its fine quality and used for everything from everyday clothing to luxury garments, and even mummy wrappings. Wines from the Western Delta region, though not as famous as those from Greece or Italy, found markets throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Alexandria also exported manufactured goods that demonstrated the city's industrial capabilities. Glass production flourished in Alexandria, with local artisans developing distinctive techniques for creating multicolored vessels and decorative objects. Pottery workshops produced both utilitarian containers and finely decorated pieces, many bearing distinctive Alexandrian motifs that blended Egyptian and Greek artistic traditions. Perfumes and unguents, made with locally grown aromatics enhanced with imported spices, were packaged in specialized containers and shipped throughout the Mediterranean world. The city was also known for its metalwork, jewelry, and furniture, all of which made their way through the harbor to foreign markets. The flow of goods wasn't only outward, of course. Alexandria's harbor welcomed ships laden with products from across the known world, making the city a marketplace of extraordinary diversity. From the western Mediterranean came Spanish silver, North African pottery, and Italian wines. Greece and Asia Minor provided marble, olive oil, and specialized textiles. The Black Sea region sent honey, wax, and salted fish. Mesopotamia contributed fine textiles and exotic spices that had traveled the Silk Road from distant China. The Arabian Peninsula supplied frankincense and myrrh, essential for religious rituals throughout the ancient world. From India came pepper, precious gems, and fine cotton, while sub-Saharan Africa provided ivory, gold, and exotic animals for royal menageries. This influx of foreign goods made Alexandria's markets a wonder of the ancient world, places where a visitor could find products from the farthest reaches of the known world and beyond. The Emporion, or main market district near the harbor, would have been a sensory kaleidoscope, the air filled with the scents of spices and perfumes, the sounds of dozens of languages being spoken by merchants and customers, the sight of goods in every color and texture imaginable. Specialized markets catered to different products and clientele, from luxury goods for the wealthy to everyday necessities for the city's substantial population. Harborfront taverns and food stalls served sailors and dockworkers, while more elegant establishments catered to wealthy merchants and visitors. The ships that carried this vast array of goods were as diverse as the cargoes themselves. The Mediterranean was plied by vessels of various sizes and designs, each adapted to particular routes and cargoes. The largest were the grain ships that carried Egypt's wheat harvest to Rome during the imperial period. Massive vessels capable of transporting thousands of tons of grain in a single voyage. These ships could be over 150 feet long and require crews of dozens of sailors to operate. At the other end of the spectrum were small coastal vessels that hopped from port to port along the shoreline, carrying smaller cargoes and often engaging in opportunistic trading as they went. Between these extremes were countless mid-sized merchant vessels, the workhorses of ancient maritime trade, typically ranging from 70 to 100 feet in length and capable of carrying several hundred tons of cargo. Most ancient Mediterranean ships were powered by a combination of sails and oars. The standard merchant vessel had a large square sail on a central mast that provided the primary propulsion when winds were favorable. Additional smaller sails might be deployed in certain conditions to increase speed or improve handling. When winds were contrary, or in tricky harbor approaches, crews would take to the oars, propelling the vessel through muscle power alone. This dual propulsion system gave these ships flexibility, but also limited their range. They generally followed coastlines, rather than striking out across the open sea, and they operated primarily during the spring and summer months, when weather conditions were most predictable. The navigation techniques used by the captains bringing their vessels into Alexandria's harbor were remarkably sophisticated, despite the absence of modern instruments. Experienced sailors used their knowledge of stars for positioning, carefully observed patterns of winds and currents, and relied on detailed mental maps of coastlines and landmarks. The Pharos lighthouse, of course, was the most important navigational aid for ships approaching Alexandria, its brilliant beam guiding vessels safely toward the harbor entrance, even in conditions of limited visibility. Once within sight of land, pilots familiar with the local waters would often come aboard to guide ships through the sometimes treacherous approaches to the harbor itself, where shifting sandbanks and submerged reefs could pose dangers to unwary captains. The business of maritime trade required sophisticated financial arrangements. Merchants might own their own vessels, but more commonly, they chartered space on ships, owned by others, or worked through agents in foreign ports. Marine loans, a specialized financial instrument in the ancient world, provided capital for trading voyages at high interest rates that reflected the significant risks involved in sea travel. Insurance-like arrangements helped spread the risk of shipwreck or piracy among multiple investors. Banking facilities in Alexandria and other major ports facilitated these transactions and provided secure storage for valuable goods and currency. The complexity of these financial networks reveals the sophistication of ancient commerce, challenging any notion that pre-modern trade was primitive or simple. Alexandria's harbor was also the entry point for less tangible but equally important imports, ideas, information, and cultural influences from across the Mediterranean world and beyond. Sailors and merchants brought not just physical goods, but news, stories, religious concepts, and technological innovations. The cosmopolitan atmosphere of the harbor district, where people from dozens of cultures interacted daily, created a uniquely fertile environment for intellectual exchange and cultural hybridization. This openness to outside influences was a defining characteristic of Alexandria throughout its history, contributing to the city's reputation as a center of learning and innovation. The maritime trade networks, centered on Alexandria's harbor, connected the city not just to the Mediterranean basin, but indirectly to much more distant regions. Goods from China, Southeast Asia, and even possibly East Africa made their way to Alexandria through complex relay trading systems. Silk from China, for instance, might travel the Silk Road to Mesopotamia, be carried overland to a Syrian port, shipped across the Mediterranean to Alexandria, and then distributed throughout Egypt, a journey of thousands of miles involving dozens of intermediaries. These extended supply chains meant that exotic goods often arrived without direct knowledge of their origins, shrouded in mystery and fantastic stories that enhanced their value and appeal. The smooth functioning of Alexandria's maritime trade required substantial infrastructure beyond the physical harbour installations we've already explored. Customs officials monitored the flow of goods, collecting taxes that formed a significant portion of the Ptolemaic and later Roman treasury's income. Translators facilitated communication between merchants speaking different languages. Notaries and record keepers documented transactions and resolved disputes. Warehouses stored goods awaiting shipment or distribution, while specialized workshops near the harbor processed raw materials into finished products. This complex commercial ecosystem employed thousands of people in occupations ranging from skilled administrators to manual laborers, all dependent on the rhythms of maritime trade flowing through the harbor. The seasonal patterns of Mediterranean shipping shaped life in Alexandria's harbor district. The ancient sailing season typically ran from late spring to early autumn, when weather conditions were most favorable. During these months, the harbor would be a hive of activity from dawn to dusk, with ships constantly arriving and departing, cargoes being loaded and unloaded, and the associated businesses operating at full capacity. The winter months brought a significant slowdown as most long-distance shipping ceased due to dangerous sea conditions. This annual cycle created a rhythm of intense activity followed by relative quiet that influenced everything from employment patterns to religious festivals associated with the sea and maritime trade. As we imagine Alexandria's harbor in its prime, we should envision not just the physical structures and vessels, but the human drama that unfolded daily in this dynamic space. Sailors reuniting with families after long voyages or enjoying the notorious pleasures of port cities before returning to sea. Merchants anxiously watching the horizon for ships carrying their investments. Dockworkers straining under heavy loads as they transferred cargoes between ship and shore. Officials inspecting goods and collecting duties. Shopkeepers hawking their wares to sailors from foreign lands. Travelers gazing in wonder at the Pharos lighthouse and the magnificent cityscape beyond. This vibrant human tapestry, woven from countless individual lives and stories, was what truly animated Alexandria's harbor and made it the beating heart of this extraordinary ancient city. The gentle Mediterranean waters that once carried thousands of ships to and from Alexandria's bustling harbor now serve as an unexpectedly effective preservation environment for the remnants of ancient maritime trade. Beneath the surface lies a museum of shipwrecks and their cargoes, time capsules from different periods of Alexandria's long history. These submerged archaeological sites present unique challenges and opportunities for preservation, requiring specialized techniques that have evolved significantly in recent decades. Let's explore the fascinating world of shipwreck conservation in the Mediterranean, focusing on the vessels discovered near Alexandria's ancient harbor and the remarkable efforts to preserve these fragile windows into the past. The Mediterranean Sea offers surprisingly good conditions for preserving shipwrecks compared to many other maritime environments. The sea's relatively warm, saline waters lack the shipworm and other wood-boring organisms that rapidly destroy wooden vessels in many oceanic regions. The limited tidal range means that shipwrecks aren't subjected to the stress of significant water pressure changes, while the generally calm conditions of this enclosed sea prevent the violent wave action that can scatter wreck sites in more exposed waters. These favorable conditions have allowed some remarkably complete shipwrecks to survive for thousands of years, particularly when they became buried in protective layers of sediment on the seabed. Several significant shipwrecks have been discovered in the waters around Alexandria, ranging from small harbor craft to substantial merchant vessels. Each represents a moment frozen in time, the final voyage of a vessel that never reached its intended destination. One of the most important discoveries was a well-preserved 1st century BCE ship found near the eastern harbor entrance, its wooden hull still maintaining much of its original shape, thanks to the protective silt that had covered it shortly after sinking. The vessel appears to have been a medium-sized merchant ship, perhaps around 80 feet in length, capable of carrying several hundred amphorae of wine, oil, or grain. The circumstances of its sinking remain unclear. Perhaps it was caught in one of Alexandria's occasional winter storms. Or maybe it struck one of the treacherous reefs that made the harbor approach so dangerous without the guidance of the Pharos lighthouse. When archaeologists discover a shipwreck like this, their first priority is careful documentation of the site exactly as it's found. Unlike land excavations, underwater sites can be disturbed by even the slightest current, potentially destroying valuable contextual information about how objects relate to one another. Modern underwater archaeology employs sophisticated mapping techniques, including photogrammetry, taking hundreds of overlapping photographs that can be digitally stitched together to create detailed three-dimensional models of the wreck site. These models allow archaeologists to study the site without disturbing it and provide a permanent record of the wreck's condition before any artifacts are removed. The actual excavation of a shipwreck requires extraordinary patience and specialized equipment. Archaeologists typically use gentle airlifts or water dredges to remove sediment covering the wreck, essentially underwater vacuum cleaners that carry away silt without damaging delicate artifacts. Each object is carefully tagged and its position recorded before it's brought to the surface. The excavation often progresses centimeter by centimeter, with archaeologists sometimes spending hours working on an area the size of a dinner plate to ensure that no information is lost and no artifacts are damaged during recovery. The moment an artifact is recovered from the seabed, the conservation process begins. Objects that have been underwater for centuries or millennia reach a kind of equilibrium with their environment, and the sudden change in conditions when they're brought to the surface can trigger rapid deterioration if not properly managed. Wooden objects that appear solid underwater may begin to fall apart as they dry, unless they're kept wet and gradually treated to replace the water in their cellular structure with preservative compounds. Metals may begin to corrode at accelerated rates when exposed to air. Ceramics, though generally more stable, may have absorbed soluble salts that can crystallize and cause damage as they dry. Each material requires its own specialized conservation protocol. The conservation of wooden ship timbers is particularly challenging and fascinating. When wood remains underwater for extended periods, the cellulose that gives it structure gradually breaks down, leaving primarily the lignin framework. Water fills the spaces left by the degraded cellulose, maintaining the wood's shape and apparent solidity. If allowed to dry naturally, this waterlogged wood would shrink catastrophically, often cracking and warping beyond recognition. To prevent this, conservators use techniques like polyethylene glycol, PEG treatment, where the water in the wood is gradually replaced by a waxy compound that maintains the wood's structure as it dries. This process can take years for large timbers and requires careful monitoring throughout. For shipwrecks found near Alexandria, one of the most common artifacts requiring conservation is the ceramic amphora, the versatile transport container of the ancient Mediterranean. These clay vessels were used to ship wine, olive oil, garum, fish sauce, and various other liquid or semi-liquid commodities. While ceramics are generally stable after recovery, they often require careful cleaning to remove marine concretions, hard, calcium-rich deposits that form on objects in seawater. Sometimes these concretions actually help preserve more delicate materials, such as the contents of an amphora, or organic materials, like rope or leather, that happen to be covered by the growing concretion. Conservators must decide carefully whether to remove these concretions or preserve them as protective matrices. Some of the most exciting discoveries from Mediterranean shipwrecks are the actual cargo remains sometimes preserved inside containers or in the hold of the vessel. Olive pits, grape seeds, spices, and even wine residues have been recovered and analyzed, providing direct evidence of what was being transported, and by extension, the trade networks that connected Alexandria to the wider Mediterranean world. These organic remains require extremely careful handling and specialized conservation techniques. Some must be kept in environments similar to those in which they were found to prevent deterioration, while others may be stabilized through freeze-drying or careful dehydration processes. Metal objects from shipwrecks present their own conservation challenges. Bronze artifacts, common in ancient Mediterranean contexts, develop characteristic green or blue patinas underwater that can actually help protect the metal from further corrosion. Iron, however, is particularly vulnerable in marine environments, often becoming encrusted with thick layers of concretion that completely obscure the original object. X-ray technology allows conservators to see through these concretions to identify the object inside before deciding on the best treatment approach. Sometimes the iron object has deteriorated so completely that only a void in the shape of the original item remains within the concretion. In these cases, conservators can fill the void with epoxy to create a perfect cast of the vanished original. Beyond the physical preservation of artifacts, modern shipwreck conservation involves extensive documentation and analysis. Material science techniques allow for precise identification of wood species used in ship construction, the clay sources for ceramic vessels, the metal composition of coins or ship fittings, and the contents of cargo containers. DNA analysis can identify the species of plants or animals represented by organic remains, while isotope analysis might reveal the geographical origin of materials. These analytical techniques transform artifacts from mere curiosities into rich sources of information about ancient trade, technology, and daily life. The conservation of entire shipwrecks, rather than just their constituent artifacts, represents one of the most ambitious challenges in maritime archaeology. Several famous examples exist in the Mediterranean region, including the Kyrenia ship in Cyprus and various Roman vessels recovered from Italian waters. These projects involve years of painstaking work and significant resources, but result in extraordinary museum displays that allow visitors to come face to face with actual ancient vessels. While no complete ship from Alexandria's harbour has yet been raised and conserved in this way, the potential exists for such a project if a sufficiently intact and significant vessel were discovered. The growing field of in situ preservation offers an alternative approach to shipwreck conservation. Rather than recovering artifacts or entire wrecks, this strategy focuses on preserving archaeological sites underwater, protecting them from both natural deterioration and human interference. Techniques might include covering a wreck site with sand or special membranes that create a protective environment, installing cathodic protection systems to prevent metal corrosion, or creating underwater archaeological parks, where visitors can observe wrecks in their original context without disturbing them. This approach recognizes that not every shipwreck can or should be excavated, especially given the substantial resources required for proper conservation of recovered materials. Public education forms another important aspect of shipwreck conservation efforts. Museums in Alexandria and elsewhere around the Mediterranean display conserved artifacts from underwater excavations, often using interactive exhibits and digital reconstructions to help visitors understand the original context and significance of these objects. Underwater archaeology centers offer training for future generations of maritime archaeologists and conservators, ensuring that specialized knowledge and skills continue to develop. Documentary films and publications bring the excitement of shipwreck discoveries to broader audiences, fostering public support for conservation efforts. Legal frameworks for protecting underwater cultural heritage have evolved significantly in recent decades, providing important tools for preserving shipwrecks in Mediterranean waters. UNESCO's 2001 Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage established international standards for managing these resources, while individual countries around the Mediterranean have strengthened their national legislation regarding shipwrecks in their territorial waters. Egypt has been particularly active in this regard, recognizing the exceptional importance of its underwater archaeological sites around Alexandria and along the northern coast. Climate change and marine pollution present growing threats to shipwreck preservation in the Mediterranean. Rising sea temperatures may increase biological activity that can damage wooden wrecks, while changing chemistry in the water, including increasing acidification, could accelerate the deterioration of many materials. Pollution from shipping, coastal development, and industrial activity introduces new chemical agents that may interact unpredictably with archaeological materials. Conservation scientists are actively monitoring these changes and developing new preservation strategies to address these emerging challenges. As we consider the quiet world of shipwreck conservation beneath the Mediterranean's blue surface, we might reflect on the remarkable connection these vessels provide to the ancient mariners who once sailed these same waters. Each preserved timber, each recovered amphora, each coin or personal possession represents a tangible link to individuals who lived, worked, and sometimes perished in Alexandria's maritime community. Through careful preservation of these fragile remnants, modern conservators enable these silent witnesses to continue telling their stories, connecting us across the centuries to the bustling harbour we've been exploring throughout our journey. The ships that never completed their voyages have, in a way, finally reached a safe harbour in our museums, our historical understanding, and our collective imagination. The tranquil waters of Alexandria's harbour once sheltered more than merchant vessels and fishing boats. They were also home to one of the ancient world's most formidable naval forces, the Ptolemaic fleet. As we continue our journey through Alexandria's maritime past, let's explore how the Ptolemaic dynasty transformed Egypt, traditionally a land power, into a dominant naval force in the eastern Mediterranean. This remarkable military transformation reflected not just strategic necessity, but the dynasty's Greek origins and their understanding that control of the sea was essential to maintaining their power in a competitive Hellenistic world. The story of Ptolemaic naval power begins with the dynasty's founder, Ptolemy Sesota. As one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals, Ptolemy had witnessed firsthand how naval strength could determine the outcome of campaigns throughout the Mediterranean. When he established himself as ruler of Egypt, following Alexander's death in 323 BCE, Ptolemy recognized that building a powerful fleet would be essential to defending his new kingdom and projecting power beyond its borders. Egypt had tremendous natural resources, wealth, grain, timber imported from Lebanon, and manpower, but lacked a strong maritime tradition. Creating a navy essentially from scratch would be one of Ptolemy's most significant and lasting achievements. Alexandria itself was designed with naval power in mind. When Alexander the Great laid out the city in 331 BCE, he included plans for specialized naval harbors alongside the commercial facilities. The eastern side of the Great Harbor featured sheltered basins and slipways specifically designed for warships, separated from the commercial areas for security and operational efficiency. These naval installations were expanded under the early Ptolemies, creating a sophisticated complex that could support the construction, maintenance, and operation of hundreds of warships. Underwater archaeological work has revealed remnants of these specialized facilities, stone slipways, where ships were drawn up out of the water when not in use, workshops where repairs were conducted, and storage buildings for equipment and supplies. The warships that dominated Ptolemaic naval power were primarily galleys propelled by oars rather than sail. The most important type was the trireme, a vessel approximately 120 feet long with 3 banks of oars on each side, requiring a crew of around 170 rowers plus officers, marines, and specialists. But the Ptolemies, like other Hellenistic rulers, engaged in a naval arms race that produced increasingly larger and more powerful vessels. Quadrimes, quinqueremes, and even larger ships with 6 or 7 banks of oars were developed, culminating in the enormous 40 that Ptolemy IV Philopator reportedly constructed, a massive vessel requiring 4,000 rowers and carrying 2,850 marines. While likely used primarily for ceremonial purposes rather than actual combat, this Leviathan demonstrated both the technical capabilities of Alexandria's shipwrights and the dynasty's determination to impress rivals with naval innovation. The construction of these warships required specialized knowledge, skilled labor, and substantial resources. Alexandria's royal shipyards employed thousands of workers, carpenters, caulkers, rope makers, sailmakers, metalworkers, and many others. The ships themselves were engineering marvels, designed for both speed and durability. Their wooden hulls were reinforced with bronze at critical points, particularly around the waterline, and at the bow where a bronze-sheathed ram served as the primary offensive weapon. The complex arrangement of rowing benches, oar ports, and internal bracing required precise calculations and expert craftsmanship to ensure the vessel would perform effectively in combat conditions. Manning these warships presented another challenge. A large trireme required 170 skilled rowers, who needed to work in perfect coordination to achieve maximum speed and maneuverability. Unlike the popular misconception of slaves chained to their oars, Ptolemaic naval rowers were typically free men, either Egyptian subjects serving as part of their obligation to the state, or mercenaries attracted by regular pay. These rowers required constant training to maintain their skills and teamwork, much like modern athletic teams. The larger vessels in the Ptolemaic fleet needed even more manpower. A quinquereme might require 300 or more rowers, while the largest ceremonial vessels demanded thousands. Beyond the rowers, each warship carried marines trained for ship-to-ship combat, archers who could rain missiles on enemy vessels, and specialized crew members responsible for navigation, signaling, and managing the complex operations of the vessel. A Ptolemaic naval officer required both technical knowledge of ship handling and tactical understanding of naval warfare. The most senior commanders typically came from the Greek elite that dominated Alexandria's upper ranks. But as the dynasty progressed, Egyptians increasingly found positions of responsibility within the naval hierarchy. At its height under Ptolemy II Philadelphus 285-246 BCE, the Ptolemaic fleet reportedly included 336 warships of various sizes, plus hundreds of smaller vessels and transports. This made it the largest naval force in the Mediterranean world, capable of projecting power far beyond Egypt's shores. The maintenance of such a fleet required enormous resources, not just the initial construction costs, but the ongoing expenses of paying crews, providing food and supplies, and conducting regular repairs and refits. Only Egypt's extraordinary agricultural wealth and efficient tax system made such a naval establishment possible. The strategic value of this naval investment became apparent during the frequent conflicts between the Ptolemies and the Hellenistic rivals, particularly the Seleucid kingdom based in Syria and Mesopotamia, and the Antigonid dynasty, controlling Macedonia and parts of Greece. Control of the sea allowed the Ptolemies to defend Egypt's coastline, maintain their overseas possessions in Cyprus and the Aegean, interrupt enemy supply lines, and project power far from their home territory. Even when facing larger land armies, Ptolemaic naval supremacy often provided a critical strategic advantage, allowing them to choose where and when to engage the enemy. The naval battles fought by the Ptolemaic fleet were complex affairs requiring sophisticated tactics and superb seamanship. The primary offensive weapon of ancient warships was the bronze-covered ram extending from the bow at the waterline. Ship captains would maneuver to strike enemy vessels from the side or rear, puncturing their hulls or shearing off their oars to render them immobile. Alternatively, they might attempt to close alongside an enemy ship to allow their marines to board and capture it in hand-to-hand combat. These engagements required precise coordination between the rowing master setting the stroke rate, the helmsman steering the vessel, the lookout scanning for opportunities, and the captain making split-second tactical decisions. One of the most famous naval engagements involving the Ptolemaic fleet was the Battle of Salamis in 306 BCE, where Ptolemy suffered a significant defeat at the hands of Demetrius Poliorcetes, son of his rival Antigonus. Demetrius employed larger vessels and innovative tactics to overcome the Ptolemaic force, capturing or destroying much of their fleet. This defeat temporarily cost Ptolemy control of Cyprus, though he would later rebuild his naval strength and reclaim the island. The battle demonstrated the dynamic nature of Hellenistic naval warfare, where advantages could shift quickly based on technological innovation, tactical creativity, or simply the skill of individual commanders. More successful was the Ptolemaic naval campaign during the First Syrian War 274-271 BCE. When the fleet under Ptolemy II Philadelphus conducted operations along the coast of Asia Minor and Syria, supporting land forces and maintaining supply lines. The ability to move troops quickly by sea and support them from offshore gave the Ptolemaic forces a significant advantage. Similarly, during the Fifth Syrian War 202-95 BCE, the fleet commanded by Ptolemy VI played a crucial role in defending Egypt's coastal approaches against Seleucid aggression, preventing a seaborne invasion that might have overwhelmed Egypt's land defenses. Beyond its military function, the Ptolemaic navy played an important role in projecting royal power and prestige. Naval reviews and demonstrations were regular features of Alexandria's civic life, with the fleet's largest and most impressive vessels put on display during religious festivals and royal celebrations. These events reinforced the dynasty's connection to Poseidon and other sea deities, emphasized the Greek maritime heritage that differentiated the Ptolemies from Egypt's previous pharaonic rulers, and reminded potential enemies of the kingdom's naval strength. The enormous forty constructed by Ptolemy IV was primarily a floating palace and ceremonial vessel rather than a practical warship, designed specifically to awe visitors with its unprecedented size and lavish appointments. The Ptolemaic navy also served important economic functions. Naval patrols suppressed piracy throughout the eastern Mediterranean, making commercial shipping safer and more reliable. This protection extended not just to Egyptian vessels, but to all merchantmen operating in waters under Ptolemaic influence, enhancing Alexandria's reputation as a secure trading hub. The navy also escorted particularly valuable cargo shipments, such as the grain fleets bound for allied cities or royal treasures being transferred between Ptolemaic territories. In times of famine or shortage, naval transports could quickly move food supplies to affected regions, demonstrating the dynasty's capacity to care for its subjects. Scientific and geographical exploration represented another significant contribution of the Ptolemaic navy. Royal expeditions ventured down the Red Sea to establish trade contacts with lands along the East African coast, and possibly as far as India. These voyages expanded geographical knowledge, identified new trading opportunities, and brought exotic goods and specimens back to Alexandria, where they might be studied by scholars at the famous library and museum. The navy thus served the Ptolemies' intellectual and cultural ambitions alongside their military and economic goals, reflecting the dynasty's multifaceted approach to power and prestige. The gradual decline of Ptolemaic naval power paralleled the dynasty's overall diminishment as Rome's influence in the eastern Mediterranean grew. Financial difficulties made it increasingly challenging to maintain a large fleet, while internal dynastic conflicts diverted resources and attention from naval readiness. By the time of Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic ruler, Egypt's navy was still significant, but no longer the dominant force it had been under the early Ptolemies. The naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE, where Cleopatra and Mark Antony's combined fleet was defeated by Octavian's forces commanded by Agrippa, marked the final end of independent Ptolemaic naval power. After Egypt's incorporation into the Roman Empire, following Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, Alexandria continued to serve as an important naval base, but now as part of Rome's extensive maritime defense system rather than as the center of an independent naval power. The specialized facilities in the Great Harbor were maintained and sometimes expanded under Roman administration, particularly given Alexandria's crucial role in shipping grain to feed Rome's population. Archaeological evidence suggests that the naval harbor remained active well into the Byzantine period, gradually diminishing in importance as Alexandria itself declined relative to Constantinople and other Byzantine centers. As we imagine the Ptolemaic warships that once dominated Alexandria's eastern harbor, their oars rising and falling in perfect unison as they conducted training exercises or departed for distant campaigns, we can appreciate how thoroughly the Ptolemaic dynasty transformed Egypt's relationship with the sea. A kingdom traditionally focused on the Nile and its agricultural wealth became, under their guidance, one of the ancient world's premier maritime powers. The naval infrastructure they created, the traditions of seamanship they established, and the strategic vision that recognized the sea as a pathway to power, rather than a boundary, all represented significant departures from Egypt's pharaonic past. In building their magnificent fleet, the Ptolemies weren't just creating a military force, they were reorienting an entire civilization toward the Mediterranean world and its maritime networks. The maritime heart of ancient Alexandria wasn't a single unified port, but rather a dual harbor system that reflected the city's complex identity and diverse needs. As we continue our gentle exploration, let's turn our attention to this fascinating dual structure, the Great Harbor to the east, and the Eunostos Harbor, whose name beautifully translates to Harbor of Safe Return, or Harbor of Good Fortune, to the west. These twin harbors, separated by the causeway connecting the mainland to the island of Pharos, serve different functions and populations within Alexandria's maritime community. creating a sophisticated port complex unmatched in the ancient Mediterranean world. The natural geography of Alexandria's coastline provided the foundation for this dual harbour system. The island of Pharos, stretching parallel to the coast approximately a half-mile offshore, created a natural breakwater that sheltered the waters behind it from the open Mediterranean. Alexander the Great and his successors recognized this advantageous arrangement and enhanced it through ambitious engineering projects. The most significant of these was the heptastadion, a massive causeway stretching the 7 stades, approximately 3/4 of a mile between the mainland and the island. This artificial connection effectively divided the sheltered waters into 2 distinct harbours. The larger eastern basin became the Great Harbour, while the western basin was known as Eunostos. The Great Harbour, embraced by the eastern curve of Pharos Island and the Lochias promontory extending from the mainland, was the more prestigious of the two. Its eastern shoreline featured the royal quarter, with palaces and government buildings overlooking the water, while the famous Pharos lighthouse stood at its entrance, guiding ships safely to port. This was where state visitors would arrive, where royal ceremonies involving naval displays would be conducted, and where the most valuable cargoes would be handled under careful supervision. The Great Harbour combined commercial functions with ceremonial and naval uses, making it a showcase for Ptolemaic power and wealth. Archaeological evidence from underwater investigations has revealed the sophisticated infrastructure that once lined the Great Harbour. Stone quays extended along much of the shoreline, providing stable platforms where ships could dock for loading and unloading. These quays were equipped with mooring stones, large blocks with holes through which ropes could be passed to secure vessels, positioned at regular intervals. Behind the quays stood warehouses and administrative buildings where cargoes could be stored, inspected and processed. Special cranes, operated by human power through systems of pulleys and counterweights, facilitated the transfer of heavy goods between ships and shore. Covered porticos provided shelter for merchants, officials and dock workers, allowing commerce to continue even during Alexandria's occasional winter rains. The eastern portion of the Great Harbour contained the specialized naval harbour we explored earlier, where the Ptolemaic warships were based. This area was partially separated from the commercial sections by protective moles and could be secured against unauthorized access. The naval harbour had its own specialized infrastructure, slipways where warships could be drawn ashore when not in use. Ancient wooden vessels needed regular drying to prevent rot, repair facilities, arsenal buildings where weapons and equipment were stored, and barracks for naval personnel. This concentration of naval power at the heart of the city demonstrated the central role of maritime strength in Ptolemaic governance and strategy. Across the heptastadion causeway lay the Eunostos harbour, which served as Alexandria's primary commercial port, particularly for bulk cargoes and everyday trade. While less prestigious than the Great Harbour, Eunostos was actually larger and handled a greater volume of shipping. Its name, Harbour of Safe Return, or Harbour of Good Fortune, reflected its importance to the merchant sailors who relied on its sheltered waters after dangerous Mediterranean voyages. The western harbour was particularly valuable because it provided better protection from the prevailing northwesterly winds that affected the region for much of the year. Ships could enter and leave Eunostos even in weather conditions that might make navigation in and out of the Great Harbour challenging. The Eunostos harbour featured its own extensive infrastructure, though generally less monumental than that of the Great Harbour. Archaeological and historical evidence indicates numerous quays, warehouses, and commercial buildings lining its shores. The western harbour was connected to Lake Marotis to the south by a navigable canal, creating an important link between Mediterranean shipping and the inland waterway system of the Nile Delta. This connection allowed goods arriving by sea to be transferred directly to river boats for distribution throughout Egypt, while agricultural products from the fertile Nile Valley could move efficiently to waiting seagoing vessels without needing to be transported through the crowded city streets. Within the western Eunostos harbour lay a smaller, even more sheltered basin called Kibotos, meaning box or chest, a name that evoked its enclosed, protected nature. This inner harbour may have served specialized functions, perhaps providing secure docking for particularly valuable cargoes or offering a refuge during the worst winter storms. Some historical sources suggest that Kibotos connected directly to the canal leading to Lake Marotis, functioning as an interface between maritime and riverine transportation networks. This sophisticated arrangement of harbours within harbours demonstrates the careful planning and engineering that went into Alexandria's port complex. The different character of the two main harbours influenced the communities that developed around them. The Great Harbour was surrounded by more elite districts, including the royal quarter to the east and wealthy Greek neighbourhoods to the south. Government officials, naval officers, luxury goods merchants, and foreign dignitaries would have been common sights along its quays. The Eunostos harbour, in contrast, developed a more working-class character, with neighbourhoods housing dockworkers, sailors, shipwrights, and those involved in bulk trade. Taverns, boarding houses, and more modest markets served the needs of these communities. This social and economic differentiation between the two harbour areas contributed to Alexandria's development as a city of distinct but interconnected districts. The different characters of the two harbours were reflected in the types of vessels typically found in each. The Great Harbour would welcome state galleys carrying diplomatic missions, specialized ships transporting high-value, low-volume luxury goods, and private vessels belonging to wealthy merchants and visitors. During major festivals or royal events, the eastern harbour might be filled with decorated ceremonial ships, their colourful sails and banners creating a spectacular display against the backdrop of the royal quarter. The Eunostos harbour, meanwhile, accommodated the workhorses of ancient maritime commerce, grain ships, timber carriers, fishing vessels, and the countless medium-sized merchantmen that connected Alexandria to ports throughout the Mediterranean. The dual harbour system proved remarkably adaptable to changing conditions over the centuries of Alexandria's history. During the Ptolemaic period, the emphasis on naval power meant that a significant portion of the Great Harbour was dedicated to military vessels. Under Roman rule, with Egypt incorporated into the empire's broader defensive system, some of these naval facilities were repurposed for the increasingly important grain trade that fed Rome's enormous population. The western Eunostos harbour grew in commercial importance during this period, handling much of the shipping for what became Rome's breadbasket province. This ability to evolve with changing political and economic circumstances helped Alexandria maintain its position as one of the Mediterranean's premier ports long after the Ptolemaic dynasty had passed into history. Navigation between the two harbours was facilitated by openings in the heptastadian causeway. This massive structure wasn't a solid barrier, but incorporated bridges or culverts that allowed small vessels to pass directly from one harbour to the other, without needing to go out to sea and around Pharos Island. This internal connection was particularly valuable during rough weather, when leaving the sheltered harbours might be dangerous. Archaeological investigations suggest that these passages through the heptastadion were sophisticated structures with mechanisms to control water flow and prevent excessive silting. Another example of the advanced engineering that characterized Alexandria's maritime infrastructure. The management of this complex dual harbour system required an equally sophisticated administrative structure. Harbour masters oversaw the assignment of berths and regulated traffic within each port. Customs officials monitored the movement of goods, collecting import and export duties that formed an important source of revenue for the Ptolemaic and later Roman treasury. Pilots with specialized local knowledge guided incoming vessels through the sometimes treacherous approaches to each harbour. A small fleet of utility vessels, tugs, lighters, patrol boats supported the daily operations of both harbours. Record keepers maintained detailed logs of arriving and departing ships, their cargoes, and the taxes paid. Some of these administrative documents have survived on papyri, giving us direct insight into the bureaucratic systems that kept Alexandria's maritime commerce functioning smoothly. The different characters of the two harbours were also reflected in their religious associations. The Great Harbour was closely linked to the dynastic cult of the Ptolemies, and to Greek deities associated with power and prestige. Poseidon as god of the sea, Zeus as ruler of gods and men. The Pharos lighthouse itself may have incorporated a shrine to these deities, or to the deified Alexander the Great. The Eunostos harbour, with its more direct connection to the commercial lifeblood of the city, likely featured shrines to Hermes as god of commerce and travellers, to Isis in her aspect as protector of sailors, and perhaps to more Egyptian deities, given the mixed population of the western districts. These religious differences reinforced the distinct identities of the two harbour areas, while providing spiritual protection for all who ventured out onto the unpredictable Mediterranean. Over time, the physical configuration of Alexandria's harbours changed due to both natural processes and human activity. The most significant transformation was the gradual silting up of the passages through the Heptastadion, eventually turning the causeway into a solid isthmus. This process, accelerated by the dumping of debris and deliberate land reclamation projects, fundamentally altered the relationship between the two harbours, making them increasingly separate rather than interconnected basins. By the medieval period, the former Heptastadion had become a substantial land bridge, wide enough to accommodate a significant neighbourhood of its own, completely separating the two harbour basins. Natural disasters also reshaped Alexandria's harbours over the centuries. The earthquakes of 365 CE and 1303 CE caused significant damage to harbour infrastructure and may have contributed to coastal subsidence that submerged portions of the ancient shoreline. These seismic events, combined with the gradual rise in sea level over the past 2 millennia, created the underwater archaeological landscape that modern researchers have been exploring, a submerged record of harbour installations, fallen buildings, and scattered artifacts. What appears on modern maps as a significantly different coastline from that of ancient Alexandria is the result of these long-term processes of change, both catastrophic and gradual. Today's visitor to Alexandria sees a shoreline and harbour configuration substantially different from what existed in the Ptolemaic or Roman periods. The modern eastern harbour occupies approximately the same area as the ancient Great Harbour, though with a significantly altered shoreline. The western harbour area has been even more dramatically transformed by modern port developments. Yet, beneath the surface of the water and beneath the modern city, elements of the ancient dual harbour system survive. Stone quays now serving as foundations for newer structures, fragments of the Pharos lighthouse incorporated into the medieval Fort Quaitby, and the submerged remains that underwater archaeologists continue to document and study. As we imagine Alexandria's ancient harbours in their prime, we should envision not just the physical infrastructure, but the constant movement and energy that animated these spaces. Ships arriving from distant ports, their sails catching the golden light of dawn as they approached the towering Pharos. Dockworkers swarming over newly arrived vessels, unloading amphorae of wine from Rhodes or olive oil from Greece. Harbour officials consulting their papyrus records as they assigned berths and calculated customs duties. Naval vessels conducting training exercises in the eastern basin, their oars rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Small boats ferrying people between the Great Harbour and Eunostos, their pilots calling greetings to friends and colleagues. The sounds of dozens of languages mingling in the air as merchants from across the Mediterranean negotiated deals. This vibrant, dynamic environment, divided between the ceremonial grandeur of the Great Harbour and the commercial bustle of Eunostos, formed the maritime heart of one of the ancient world's greatest cities, a dual harbour system as complex and sophisticated as Alexandria itself. The relationship between Alexandria's inhabitants and the waters surrounding their city extended beyond the normal maritime activities of sailing, fishing, and trade. When valuable cargo slipped beneath the waves or important structures needed underwater maintenance, a specialized group of workers would answer the call, the ancient divers of Alexandria. These remarkable individuals developed techniques and technologies for working underwater that, while primitive by modern standards, demonstrated impressive ingenuity and courage. As we continue our gentle journey through Alexandria's maritime past, let's explore the fascinating world of ancient diving and underwater salvage in the harbour waters that have captivated our imagination throughout our story. Working underwater in the ancient world presented fundamental challenges that modern divers, equipped with scuba equipment and sophisticated support systems, can hardly imagine. The most basic limitation was breath-holding capacity, a skilled human diver can typically remain submerged for only a few minutes before requiring air. This severely restricted the depth and duration possible for underwater work. Yet, historical records and archaeological evidence suggest that ancient Mediterranean divers regularly worked at depths of 30 feet or more, recovering cargo from shipwrecks, maintaining harbor installations, and even participating in military operations. How did they accomplish these feats with the limited technology available to them? The simplest and most common diving technique in ancient Alexandria was undoubtedly free diving, swimming down from the surface while holding one's breath, performing the necessary task, and returning for air. Free diving remains a remarkable human capability, with modern practitioners able to reach astonishing depths and durations after proper training and preparation. In Alexandria, certain individuals would have specialized in this skill, developing the physical conditioning and mental discipline required to extend their underwater time as much as possible. These professional divers likely began training in childhood, gradually building their lung capacity and comfort in the underwater environment. Archaeological evidence from across the Mediterranean world suggests that ancient divers used various aids to enhance their capabilities. Diving weights, typically made of stone with holes for attachment to the body, helped swimmers descend more quickly, conserving precious oxygen for the actual work rather than the journey down. Some recovered examples of these weights have been found with convenient handholds or body-conforming shapes, suggesting their specialized purpose. Counterbalancing these weights were primitive buoyancy aids, inflated animal bladders, or sealed pottery vessels containing air that could help divers return to the surface more efficiently or maintain a specific depth while working. One of the most interesting ancient diving innovations was the early breathing tube or snorkel. Archaeological evidence and historical accounts suggest that hollow reeds or specially constructed tubes allowed divers to remain just below the surface while breathing atmospheric air. This technique would have been particularly useful for shallow water tasks in Alexandria's harbor, such as hull inspections or minor underwater repairs. However, the physics of water pressure limited the effectiveness of these breathing tubes to very shallow depths, typically less than 2 feet, as the human lungs cannot overcome the pressure differential to draw air through a tube at greater depths. For more substantial underwater operations, ancient Alexandria may have employed early diving bells, large inverted vessels that trapped air when submerged, creating a pocket where divers could refresh their breath before continuing work. While no actual diving bells have been recovered from Alexandria's harbor, the technology was known in the ancient Mediterranean world. Greek philosopher Aristotle described the principle in the 4th century BCE, noting that divers could use an inverted cauldron to create an air chamber underwater. Such devices would have been particularly useful for extended work on harbor installations, ship repairs, or salvage operations, where divers needed to remain at depth for longer periods than a single breath would allow. The salvage of cargo and valuable materials from shipwrecks represented one of the primary motivations for ancient underwater work. When ships sank in the relatively shallow waters of Alexandria's harbor, their cargoes were often recoverable, and salvage operations could be quite profitable. Historical records suggest that specialized salvage contractors existed in major port cities, offering their services to recover goods from sunken vessels for a percentage of the value retrieved. These early salvage experts combined diving skills with specialized tools and techniques for locating and recovering submerged items. The tools used by ancient salvage divers were ingeniously adapted for underwater work. Long hooks and tongs allowed divers to grab objects without needing to get as close, extending their reach and efficiency. Baskets or nets attached to ropes could be filled with smaller items and then pulled to the surface by assistants in boats. For heavier objects, more complex lifting arrangements were developed. Historical accounts describe the use of empty amphorae as flotation devices, sealed empty containers attached to sunken objects to provide buoyancy and reduce their effective weight. Modern experiments have demonstrated that this technique works remarkably well, with a medium-sized amphora capable of providing approximately 40 pounds of lift when submerged. For the most challenging salvage operations involving extremely heavy objects, ancient engineers developed more elaborate systems. Large wooden cranes, mounted on barges, could provide substantial lifting power when operated by teams of workers or animal power. These floating cranes might be positioned directly over a wreck site, with divers attaching lifting hooks or ropes to the submerged target. The limited depth at which divers could work effectively meant that the most successful salvage operations focused on wrecks in shallow waters. Fortunately, many ships foundered near harbors or coastlines rather than in the deep open sea. Alexandria's harbor would have presented particularly favorable conditions for diving and salvage work. The waters were relatively clear compared to many Mediterranean ports, improving underwater visibility. The enclosed nature of both the Great Harbor and Eunostos Harbor meant that wave action was limited, creating calmer working conditions. The water temperature, while cool in winter, was moderate enough to allow extended diving operations throughout much of the year. These favorable conditions, combined with the high volume of shipping and occasional storms that claimed vessels despite the harbor's protection, would have provided plenty of opportunities for Alexandria's diving specialists to practice their craft. Military applications for diving emerged as naval warfare became increasingly sophisticated during the Hellenistic period. Historical accounts describe underwater saboteurs who could damage enemy ships by boring holes in their hulls or cutting anchor cables. During the Roman siege of Syracuse in 213–212 BCE, the Greek mathematician Archimedes allegedly organized divers to attack Roman ships from below, causing considerable disruption to the besieging fleet. While we have no specific records of such underwater military operations in Alexandria's harbor, the city's status as a major naval base and its long history of conflicts with rival powers suggest that defensive underwater capabilities would have been developed and maintained. The maintenance of Alexandria's harbor infrastructure required regular underwater work that went beyond emergency salvage operations. The wooden pilings supporting docks and quays needed inspection and occasional replacement due to damage from marine organisms. Stone breakwaters and moles settled over time, requiring reinforcement or repair. The foundations of the Pharos lighthouse itself demanded regular underwater inspection to ensure its stability. These maintenance tasks created steady employment for Alexandria's community of diving specialists, who would have developed intimate knowledge of the underwater structures throughout both harbors. Another important role for divers in Alexandria involved the recovery of items accidentally dropped overboard during normal port operations. In a busy harbor handling valuable cargoes, costly items inevitably found their way into the water: merchants' goods, personal possessions, tools and equipment. The relatively shallow depth of much of the harbor meant that recovery was often possible if skilled divers were available. Historical records and archaeological evidence from other Mediterranean ports suggest that designated areas existed where divers could be hired for such recovery work, with payment typically based on a percentage of the value recovered. The dangers faced by ancient divers were considerable, extending well beyond the basic risk of drowning. Repeated breath-hold diving can lead to various physiological problems, including blackouts from hypoxia if a diver misjudges their air supply. Cold water temperatures, especially during winter months, posed risks of hypothermia during extended work sessions. Physical injuries were common: cuts from sharp objects, impacts with underwater structures, and entanglement in ropes or debris. Marine life presented another hazard, with jellyfish, sea urchins, and occasionally more dangerous creatures posing threats to unprotected divers. The limited underwater visibility, especially when sediment was disturbed during work, created additional challenges and dangers. Despite these risks, diving appears to have been a recognized profession in ancient Alexandria and other major port cities. Literary references suggest that divers often formed a distinct occupational group, perhaps organized into guilds or associations like other specialized workers. They likely developed their own traditions, specialized knowledge, and professional practices, passed down from experienced divers to apprentices. Archaeological evidence from across the Mediterranean indicates that divers sometimes had distinctive grave markers, reflecting the importance of their unusual profession to their identity. The spiritual aspects of diving in the ancient world deserve mention as well. Descending beneath the surface meant entering a realm associated with powerful and potentially dangerous deities. Divers likely observed specific religious rituals before undertaking significant underwater work, seeking protection from gods associated with the sea. In Alexandria, with its syncretic religious traditions blending Greek and Egyptian elements, divers might have honored Poseidon as the Greek god of the sea, Isis in her aspect as protector of sailors, or specialized local deities associated with the harbor waters. Small shrines dedicated to these protective powers have been found in harbor areas throughout the ancient Mediterranean. While the diving techniques used in ancient Alexandria might seem primitive compared to modern scuba equipment, they represented significant innovations for their time and allowed for underwater work that would otherwise have been impossible. The individuals who developed and practiced these techniques demonstrated remarkable courage, physical capability, and problem-solving creativity. Their underwater labors helped maintain Alexandria's crucial maritime infrastructure, recovered valuable goods that would otherwise have been lost, and contributed to the city's reputation as a center for technical innovation and specialized expertise. As the centuries passed, Alexandria's diving traditions would have evolved with changing technologies and needs. The city's decline from its Hellenistic and Roman heights inevitably affected its maritime specializations, including diving. Yet the basic techniques developed in ancient times remained the foundation of underwater work until the revolutionary invention of self-contained breathing apparatus in the 20th century. When modern archaeologists began exploring Alexandria's submerged ruins in the mid-20th century, they were, in a sense, following in the footsteps, or perhaps fin strokes of those ancient divers who had worked in these same waters 2 millennia earlier, a connection across time in the silent realm beneath the waves. The legacy of ancient diving and salvage techniques extends beyond historical interest. Modern experimental archaeologists have reconstructed and tested many of the methods believed to have been used by ancient Mediterranean divers, demonstrating their effectiveness, despite their simplicity. These experiments help us appreciate the ingenuity of ancient solutions to the challenges of working underwater, and remind us that impressive results can be achieved even without advanced technology, when human skill, determination, and creativity are applied to solving practical problems. The ancient divers of Alexandria, moving silently through the harbor waters to recover lost treasures or repair vital infrastructure, represent one more fascinating facet of the maritime world we've been exploring throughout our journey. Beneath the gentle Mediterranean waves that lap against Alexandria's modern shoreline lie scattered remnants of ancient commerce, the cargoes of merchant vessels that never completed their journeys. These sunken treasures, preserved in the silty harbor bottom for 2 millennia, serve as detailed time capsules of Alexandria's far-reaching trade networks. As we continue our exploration of this remarkable maritime city, let's examine what these submerged cargo manifests tell us about the goods that once flowed through Alexandria's harbors, connecting Egypt to the wider Mediterranean world and beyond. Each amphora, each coin, each luxury item recovered from these underwater sites represents not just a commercial transaction, but a connection between distant cultures, a physical embodiment of the exchange networks that made Alexandria one of the ancient world's most cosmopolitan centers. The most common artifacts recovered from shipwrecks near Alexandria are amphorae, the versatile ceramic containers that served as the shipping crates of the ancient world. These distinctive vessels, with their pointed bases designed to be stacked efficiently in a ship's hold, transported liquids like wine, olive oil, and fish sauce, as well as semi-liquid products like honey and preserved fruits. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of amphorae from the waters around Alexandria, many still bearing painted or stamped markings that identify their contents, place of origin, or the merchants responsible for shipping them. The diversity of these markings reveals the extraordinary reach of Alexandria's trade networks, with containers originating from Spain, Italy, Greece, North Africa, and the Levant, all found mingled together on the harbor bottom. Wine amphorae are particularly prevalent among these underwater finds, reflecting the importance of this commodity in ancient Mediterranean trade. The wines of Greece, particularly from islands like Rhodes, Chios, and Kos, were highly prized throughout the region. Their distinctive amphorae, identifiable by their characteristic shapes and clay compositions, have been found in significant numbers in Alexandria's harbour, often bearing stamped handles that identify specific producers or vintage years. Italian wines, especially those from Campania, became increasingly common after Egypt fell under Roman influence. Egyptian wines from the Nile Delta, while generally considered of lesser quality than these imported varieties, were also shipped through Alexandria for export to other markets, demonstrating that trade flowed in multiple directions. Olive oil, another staple of Mediterranean life, figures prominently in the cargo manifests preserved underwater. Spanish olive oil amphorae, particularly from the Baretis-Guadalquivir Valley region, appear frequently in shipwrecks dating to the Roman period. These distinctive globular containers, known as Dressel 20 amphorae, could hold approximately 70 litres of oil each, and were produced in enormous quantities to supply Rome's insatiable demand. Greek and North African olive oils also reached Alexandria's harbours in their own regionally distinctive containers. The presence of these various oil amphorae in shipwreck sites tells us not only about trade patterns, but about culinary preferences and economic connections across the Mediterranean basin. Perhaps the most distinctive, and to modern sensibilities, unusual, commodity transported in amphorae was garum, the fermented fish sauce that served as a primary flavoring ingredient in ancient Mediterranean cuisine. Similar to modern Asian fish sauce, garum was produced by fermenting small fish with salt and herbs, creating a pungent, protein-rich condiment used in countless dishes. Spanish garum from Cádiz, modern Cadiz, was considered particularly excellent and commanded premium prices. Special amphorae, designed specifically for this product, have been identified in underwater sites around Alexandria. Their sealed lids and sometimes double-walled construction preventing leakage of their potent contents during shipment. The presence of these specialized containers demonstrates the sophisticated product packaging that developed to support long-distance trade in premium commodities. Beyond these liquid commodities, the underwater cargo manifests include evidence of dry goods transported in various containers. Grain. Egypt's primary export was typically shipped in sacks rather than ceramic containers, leaving less obvious archaeological evidence. However, specialized ships designed specifically for the grain trade have been identified in the archaeological record, with holds configured to carry massive quantities of wheat or barley in bulk. Other agricultural products arrived in Alexandria, in distinctive packaging, dates from the Levant in specialized baskets, dried fruits from Greece in small ceramic jars, nuts and pulses in cloth or leather bags, occasionally preserved in oxygen-poor underwater environments. Luxury goods form a particularly interesting category of cargo, recovered from Alexandria's underwater sites. These high-value, low-volume items were the premium products of ancient commerce, often traveling thousands of miles through complex trade networks before reaching their final destinations. Fine pottery, particularly the glossy red-slipped tablewares produced in Eastern Mediterranean workshops, appears frequently in shipwreck cargoes. These elegant cups, plates, and serving vessels were valued throughout the ancient world for their quality and aesthetic appeal. Often packed carefully in straw-cushioned crates, they could be transported in substantial quantities, with some shipwrecks yielding hundreds or even thousands of intact vessels intended for distribution to wealthy households or for use in high-end dining establishments. Glassware represents another luxury category, well represented in underwater finds. Alexandria itself became famous for its glass-making industry during the Hellenistic and Roman periods, with local artisans developing innovative techniques for creating multicolored, patterned glass vessels of extraordinary beauty. These delicate items required specialized packaging for maritime transport, typically wooden boxes with individual compartments lined with straw or fabric to prevent breakage during rough seas. Shipwrecks containing glass cargo provide particular challenges and opportunities for underwater archaeologists. The fragile material often breaks during the wrecking process, but the underwater environment can preserve the pieces in their original arrangement, allowing for reconstruction of complete vessels that might be far more scattered and degraded in terrestrial sites. Statuary and architectural elements in stone or bronze, sometimes formed part of merchant vessel cargoes, especially during periods when Hellenistic and Roman elites were eagerly acquiring Greek artworks for their homes and public buildings. Several shipwrecks discovered in the Mediterranean, though not yet specifically in Alexandria's harbours, contained substantial cargoes of marble statues, architectural fragments, or unworked stone blocks intended for later carving. These high-value, extremely heavy cargoes represented significant investments and required specialized handling during both loading and transportation. When such vessels sank, they often remained undisturbed on the seabed for centuries. The value of their cargo balanced against the extreme difficulty of salvage at any significant depth. Metals and minerals formed another important category of goods transported through Alexandria's harbours. Copper from Cyprus, tin from distant Britain, iron from Asia Minor, and lead from Spain all passed through the city, either as raw materials or as finished products. These valuable commodities were typically transported in ingot form, standardized shapes and weights that facilitated both handling and accounting. Lead ingots recovered from Mediterranean shipwrecks often bear stamps identifying their source mine or the merchant responsible for their transport, providing direct evidence of supply chains that stretched across thousands of miles. Alexandria's role as a manufacturing center made it a particularly important destination for raw materials, which would be transformed into finished goods in the city's numerous workshops before being redistributed throughout Egypt and beyond. Exotic materials from beyond the Mediterranean basin also appear in Alexandria's underwater cargo manifests, demonstrating the city's connections to truly distant lands. Ivory from sub-Saharan Africa, transported northward along the Nile, was carved into luxury items in Alexandrian workshops. Baltic amber, having traveled overland across Europe, was shaped into jewelry and decorative objects. Pearls from the Persian Gulf and semi-precious stones from as far as India arrived via Red Sea routes, often after changing hands multiple times along extensive trading networks. These rare materials commanded premium prices and catered to the luxury market that flourished in Ptolemaic and Roman Alexandria. The spice trade represented one of the most valuable aspects of Alexandria's commerce, connecting the city to sources as distant as India, Arabia, and possibly even Southeast Asia. Pepper, cinnamon, frankincense, myrrh, nard, and dozens of other aromatic substances passed through Alexandria's harbours, typically in specialized containers designed to preserve their precious contents. These high-value, low-volume commodities were particularly attractive cargo for merchants, as a relatively small shipment could yield substantial profits. Archaeological evidence for this trade comes not just from the containers themselves, but sometimes from the actual preserved spices, identified through microscopic analysis, and even, occasionally, by their still detectable scents when underwater sediments are first disturbed after centuries of burial. Textiles, though rarely preserved in underwater environments, nevertheless figured prominently in Alexandria's trade. Egyptian linen was renowned throughout the Mediterranean for its exceptional quality, while imported silks from distant China, arriving via complex overland and maritime routes, catered to the luxury market. Wool from Greece, Spain, and North Africa arrived for processing in Alexandria's textile workshops, where skilled artisans might combine different fibers and dyes to create distinctive products. While the textiles themselves have mostly perished, archaeological evidence for this trade comes from specialized tools, dye workshops, textile labels written on papyrus, and occasional extraordinary preservations, where specific conditions prevented normal decomposition. The coinage found in shipwreck contexts provides particularly valuable information about the financial aspects of ancient trade. Mixed collections of coins from various cities and kingdoms reveal the complex monetary environment in which Mediterranean merchants operated. Ptolemaic coins predominated in Alexandria during the dynastic period, but Roman, Greek, and other currencies circulated alongside them, especially in the cosmopolitan harbour districts. In shipwrecks, coins might be found as concentrated hoards, perhaps a merchant's or passenger's personal wealth, or scattered individually throughout the site, possibly representing the spending money of various crew members. These numismatic finds help archaeologists date shipwrecks more precisely and understand the economic context in which trading voyages operated. Personal possessions recovered from merchant vessel. Wrecks add a poignant human dimension to the cargo manifests. A captain's navigation instruments. A merchant's counting board. A sailor's good luck amulet. A passenger's jewelry or cosmetic implements. These intimate items connect us directly to the individuals who lived, worked, and sometimes perished on the dangerous Mediterranean shipping lanes. Unlike deliberately traded cargo, these personal items offer glimpses into the daily lives and private concerns of the people who animated Alexandria's maritime commerce. Their presence reminds us that behind the impressive statistics of trade volumes and cargo values were individual human stories, ambitions, fears, professional pride, and mundane routines, playing out on vessels that connected distant shores. The distribution of goods within shipwrecks can reveal much about loading practices and shipboard organization. Careful archaeological documentation shows that ancient merchant vessels were loaded with considerable thought to weight distribution, accessibility, and protection of fragile items. Heavier cargoes were typically placed low in the hull for stability, while more delicate goods might be stowed in the stern area, possibly under the direct supervision of the captain or a merchant traveling with valuable wares. Different commodities were often separated by wooden partitions or straw padding to prevent damage during the inevitable shifting that occurred in rough seas. These loading patterns represent a sophisticated understanding of maritime physics and practical shipboard management. The preservation conditions in Alexandria's harbour provide both challenges and opportunities for understanding ancient cargo manifests. The relatively shallow, protected waters meant that many shipwrecks were heavily salvaged in antiquity, with valuable cargoes recovered soon after sinking. This ancient salvage activity has left some wreck sites significantly disturbed, with only the less valuable or inaccessible portions of cargoes remaining for modern archaeologists to study. Conversely, the harbour's silty bottom has sometimes preserved organic materials that would have perished in more exposed underwater environments, allowing insights into commodities like textiles, foodstuffs, and wooden objects that are rarely recovered from typical Mediterranean shipwrecks. What makes these underwater cargo manifests particularly valuable is their nature as closed contexts, assemblages of goods that were all in use at the same moment when the ship sank. Unlike many archaeological sites, where objects might have accumulated over decades or centuries, this allows archaeologists to study combinations of goods that were definitely contemporaneous, revealing which products were shipped together, which regional trading connections were active simultaneously, and how various commodities were packaged and transported in relation to one another. Each shipwreck, in essence, provides a snapshot of maritime trade at a specific moment in Alexandria's long commercial history. As we imagine these sunken cargoes resting on the harbour bottom, we can picture the vibrant commercial ecosystem they represent. Merchants negotiating prices in multiple languages on Alexandria's quaysides. Ship captains carefully supervising the loading of valuable freight. Dockworkers sweating as they transferred heavy amphorae from warehouse to vessel. Scribes recording cargo details on wax tablets or papyrus scrolls. And customs officials calculating taxes on goods entering or leaving the port. The underwater cargo manifests allow us to reconstruct these commercial networks in remarkable detail, transforming abstract concepts of trade and commerce into specific, tangible exchanges of goods that connected distant cultures and shaped the daily lives of people throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. In these silent submerged treasures, Alexandria's role as a crossroads of civilizations is preserved, waiting to be rediscovered and reinterpreted by each new generation of underwater archaeologists. The silent power of the earth has shaped Alexandria's maritime landscape as surely as human hands, though far more dramatically and sometimes catastrophically. Throughout its long history, Alexandria has experienced numerous seismic events that have damaged, destroyed, and ultimately submerged portions of its magnificent coastal structures. As we continue our gentle exploration of this ancient harbour, let's examine how earthquakes have transformed Alexandria's maritime infrastructure over the centuries, turning proud monuments like the Pharos lighthouse into underwater archaeological sites, and reshaping the very relationship between the city and its harbours. Alexandria sits near a complex geological zone, where the African tectonic plate interacts with the Anatolian and Eurasian plates. While not as seismically active as Greece or Turkey, Egypt's northern coast has experienced significant earthquakes throughout recorded history. The seismic activity affecting Alexandria comes primarily from distant but powerful earthquake zones in the eastern Mediterranean, particularly the Hellenic Arc south of Crete and the Cyprus Arc. These distant origins actually increase the potential for damage, as the seismic waves travel through the Earth's crust in ways that can amplify their effects at specific locations, including Alexandria's coastal areas. Historical records mention several significant earthquakes that affected Alexandria during the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, though the details are often vague. Strabo, writing in the late 1st century BCE, refers to frequent subsidences affecting the coastline, suggesting that relatively minor seismic events may have been common. More dramatic accounts describe a major earthquake around 320 BCE, not long after Alexandria's foundation, that reportedly damaged early construction in the city. If accurate, this event would have influenced the subsequent development of the harbour infrastructure, perhaps encouraging more earthquake-resistant construction techniques for critical structures like the Pharos lighthouse. The most thoroughly documented ancient earthquake to affect Alexandria occurred on July 21, 365 CE. This catastrophic event, with an estimated magnitude above 8.0, had its epicenter near Crete, but caused widespread destruction throughout the eastern Mediterranean region. Historical accounts describe devastating effects in Alexandria, including significant damage to buildings, numerous casualties, and most relevant to our exploration, dramatic changes to the coastline. According to Ammianus Marcellinus, a contemporary historian, the sea first receded dramatically, the characteristic withdrawal that precedes a tsunami, before returning as an enormous wave that overwhelmed the coastline, carrying ships over the tops of buildings and depositing them up to 2 miles inland. Modern geological studies have confirmed that this event generated a major tsunami that would have struck Alexandria's harbours with devastating force. The 365 CEE earthquake and tsunami likely caused significant damage to Alexandria's harbour installations. Quays, warehouses, and other structures along the waterfront would have been battered by both the seismic shaking and the subsequent tsunami. Archaeological evidence suggests that some sections of the harbour facilities were never fully rebuilt after this disaster, marking a significant point in Alexandria's gradual transition from its classical heyday to its more diminished medieval status. The psychological impact of the event was also profound, with some contemporary Christian writers interpreting it as divine punishment, and others as an apocalyptic sign. This catastrophe became a reference point in Mediterranean cultural memory, mentioned in texts for centuries afterward. While the 365 CE earthquake was exceptional in its intensity, other significant seismic events affected Alexandria in the late ancient and medieval periods. A series of earthquakes in the 8th century CE caused substantial damage to coastal structures, while particularly severe events are recorded for 796, 951, and 956 CE. The Arabic historian, al-Masudi, writing in the 10th century, describes how earthquake damage had transformed Alexandria's once magnificent harbours, with many ancient structures lying in ruins or beneath the waves. By this period, the cumulative effects of multiple seismic events had significantly altered the physical relationship between the city and its maritime infrastructure. Perhaps the most dramatic earthquake-related transformation involved the fate of the Pharos lighthouse. This magnificent structure withstood numerous seismic events over its long history, demonstrating the skill of its original builders and the effectiveness of repairs made after various earthquakes. However, a series of severe earthquakes in the medieval period, particularly those in 956, 1303, and 1323 CE, progressively weakened and eventually toppled this wonder of the ancient world. Arab sources describe the lighthouse as being significantly shortened after the 956 CE earthquake, with the upper sections collapsed. By the time of the massive 1303 quake, estimated at magnitude 8.0, the structure was further damaged. The final collapse may have come with the 1323 event, though some accounts suggest portions remained standing into the early 15th century. The ruins of the lighthouse became an underwater archaeological site, as the foundation platform and lower sections of the structure tumbled into the surrounding waters. Many of these massive stone blocks remained scattered on the seabed near the eastern harbour entrance, identifiable by their dimensions, distinctive workmanship, and the quality of the materials. Some blocks were later salvaged and reused in the construction of the Kate Bay Fortress, built in 1477 CE on the site of the former lighthouse. Modern underwater archaeological surveys have documented hundreds of these architectural elements, allowing for partial reconstruction of the Pharos' appearance through the analysis of its scattered remains. Beyond the dramatic case of the Pharos lighthouse, earthquakes have affected Alexandria's maritime structures in more subtle but equally significant ways. Seismic events have contributed to coastal subsidence, the gradual sinking of the land relative to sea level, which has submerged portions of the ancient shoreline. While some of this subsidence occurs naturally through geological processes, earthquake activity can accelerate and accentuate these changes. The foundations of harbours, quays, and waterfront buildings gradually shifted downward with each major seismic event, eventually bringing them below the water level. This process created the underwater archaeological landscape that modern researchers have been exploring since the mid-20th century. The pattern of earthquake damage, visible in underwater structures, reveals much about both the nature of seismic activity affecting Alexandria and the construction techniques used in different periods. Ptolemaic structures typically show damage patterns consistent with their solid but somewhat rigid construction methods. Large, precisely cut stone blocks that could withstand considerable force but might fail catastrophically when their structural limits were exceeded. Roman-era additions and modifications often incorporated techniques specifically designed to absorb seismic energy, such as alternating courses of stone and brick, or the use of wooden reinforcements within masonry. Byzantine repairs, following the major 365 CE earthquake, show an even greater emphasis on flexible construction meant to withstand future seismic events. Archaeological investigation of earthquake damage requires specialized techniques to distinguish between destruction caused by seismic events and other processes such as normal structural deterioration, storm damage, or intentional demolition. Certain patterns of damage are characteristic of earthquake effects. Particular types of cracks in masonry, the distinctive collapse patterns of columns and walls, and the presence of seismic horizons in archaeological stratigraphy, where destruction debris from a specific event is concentrated. Underwater archaeology adds further complications to this analysis, as the marine environment introduces additional deterioration factors and sometimes obscures evidence through sediment deposition or the growth of marine organisms on structural remains. Modern scientific techniques have enhanced our understanding of Alexandria's seismic history. Carbon dating of organic materials found in destruction layers helps establish precise chronologies for major earthquake events. Analysis of sediment cores from the harbour bottom reveals tsunami deposits that can be correlated with historical accounts of seismic activity. Computer modelling allows archaeologists to simulate how structures like the Pharos lighthouse would have responded to earthquakes of various magnitudes and characteristics. These approaches complement the traditional archaeological and historical evidence to create a more complete picture of how earthquake activity has shaped Alexandria's maritime landscape over the centuries. The human response to earthquake damage throughout Alexandria's history reveals much about the city's changing fortunes and priorities. During the Ptolemaic period, when Alexandria was at the height of its wealth and importance, repairs to earthquake-damaged harbour installations were typically prompt and comprehensive, maintaining the full functionality of maritime facilities. The Roman administration similarly prioritized the maintenance of critical infrastructure, particularly given Alexandria's crucial role in supplying grain to Rome. By the Byzantine period, repairs became more selective, focusing on essential functions while allowing some damaged areas to remain unrestored. This pattern accelerated in the Islamic period, with earthquake repairs increasingly concentrated on the western harbour areas as the eastern harbour gradually diminished in importance. Adapting to the effects of seismic activity became an ongoing challenge for Alexandria's harbour administrators throughout the city's history. After major earthquakes, navigation channels might need redredging due to shifted sediments or collapsed structures. Quays and docking facilities required rebuilding, sometimes at different elevations than their predecessors, as the coastline gradually subsided. The lighthouse needed regular inspection and reinforcement to ensure it remained stable despite the cumulative effects of multiple seismic events. These adaptations represented a significant ongoing investment of resources and engineering expertise, demonstrating the critical importance of the harbour facilities to Alexandria's economic and strategic position. The psychological impact of earthquake damage on Alexandria's population must have been profound, particularly when major seismic events damaged iconic structures like the Pharos lighthouse that were central to the city's identity. Ancient and medieval sources describe the fear and religious interpretation that accompanied major earthquakes, with different faith traditions, pagan, Christian, and Islamic, each providing their own frameworks for understanding these terrifying natural phenomena. The visible evidence of earthquake destruction in the harbour area would have served as a constant reminder of human vulnerability in the face of natural forces, perhaps contributing to the emphasis on divine protection that characterized maritime activities throughout Alexandria's history. From a modern archaeological perspective, earthquake damage has created both challenges and opportunities for understanding Alexandria's maritime past. The subsidence caused by seismic activity has submerged many ancient structures, protecting them from later urban development and preserving them for underwater archaeology. Yet the same earthquakes have scattered and fragmented these structures, making interpretation more difficult. The distinctive layers of destruction and repair visible in harbour installations provide valuable chronological markers for archaeologists, helping to date different phases of construction and modification. In this way, the very forces that damaged Alexandria's maritime structures have also helped preserve their history for modern study. As climate change raises new concerns about sea level rise and increased storm activity, Alexandria's long history of adapting to earthquake-induced coastal changes offers both cautionary lessons and potential inspiration. The ancient engineers, who repeatedly rebuilt harbour facilities as the coastline gradually subsided, demonstrated remarkable resilience and technical ingenuity. Their solutions, raising quay levels, reinforcing vulnerable structures, relocating certain functions to more stable areas, represent early examples of coastal adaptation strategies that may have renewed relevance as modern Alexandria faces similar challenges, albeit from different causes. For visitors to modern Alexandria, the earthquake-related transformations of the ancient harbour create a disconnect between the contemporary coastline and historical descriptions of the city. The eastern harbour still occupies roughly the same area as in ancient times, but with a significantly altered shoreline and depth profile. The site of the magnificent Pharos lighthouse is now occupied by the medieval Causeway fort, incorporating some of the ancient structure's fallen stones. Underwater, scattered architectural elements and partially submerged harbour installations tell the story of a coastline repeatedly transformed by seismic activity over more than 2 millennia. This juxtaposition of past and present, above and below the waterline, makes Alexandria a uniquely thought-provoking place to contemplate the long relationship between human construction and natural forces. As we imagine Alexandria's harbour structures being shaken by earth tremors, with stones shifting, columns swaying, and eventually some toppling into the waiting sea, we're reminded of the impermanence of even the most magnificent human creations. The Pharos lighthouse, built to withstand the ages, eventually succumbed to the inexorable forces beneath the Earth's crust. Yet in another sense, these structures have achieved a different kind of permanence, preserved beneath the waves, studied by archaeologists, and living on in our historical imagination. The earthquakes that damaged Alexandria's coastal structures have, paradoxically, helped ensure that they remain objects of fascination and study more than 2,000 years after their construction, their scattered remains telling stories of both human ambition and natural power. As the gentle Mediterranean waves lapped against the quaysides of Alexandria's western harbour, they often carried massive ships unlike any others in the ancient world, the grain freighters bound for Rome. These specialized vessels represented perhaps the most vital connection between Egypt and the heart of the Roman Empire, carrying the wheat harvests that would feed Rome's enormous population. As we continue our exploration of Alexandria's maritime story, let's examine this remarkable lifeline of grain shipments that linked the fertile Nile Valley to the distant imperial capital, creating one of history's earliest examples of a globally significant food supply chain. The grain trade was not merely an economic arrangement, but a critical strategic relationship that influenced Roman policy toward Egypt for centuries. The story begins with Egypt's extraordinary agricultural productivity. The annual Nile flood transformed the river valley into one of the ancient world's most reliable breadbaskets, depositing fresh, nutrient-rich silt across the fields each year. This natural irrigation and fertilization system allowed Egyptian farmers to produce grain harvests of remarkable consistency and abundance. Even in years when other Mediterranean regions experienced crop failures due to drought or other adverse conditions, Egypt typically produced surpluses. This agricultural wealth had long been the foundation of Egyptian power and cultural achievement, but under Roman administration, it was systematically directed toward feeding the empire's hungry capital. Rome's need for Egyptian grain was a direct consequence of its unusual urban development. By the early imperial period, Rome had grown to an estimated population of 1 million people, an extraordinary concentration of humanity by ancient standards, and a level of urbanization that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. This massive population couldn't be fed from the surrounding Italian countryside alone. While Italy produced significant amounts of grain, much of its agricultural land had been converted to higher value crops, like olives and grapes, or to pasture for livestock. The solution to feeding Rome's masses lay in importing grain from the most productive provinces, particularly Sicily, North Africa, and above all, Egypt. The scale of this grain trade was staggering. Historical sources suggest that Egypt supplied Rome with approximately 20 million modern Roman volumetric unit of wheat annually during the early imperial period, roughly equivalent to 135,000 tons. This amount could feed an estimated 200,000–300,000 people for an entire year, representing perhaps a quarter to a third of Rome's total grain supply. The logistics of moving such enormous quantities of food over maritime distances of more than 1,500 miles required sophisticated organization, specialized shipping, and considerable infrastructure at both ends of the journey. Alexandria's harbor facilities formed a critical link in this vital supply chain. The journey of Egyptian grain to Roman tables began in the fields of the Nile Valley, where wheat was harvested, threshed, and collected as tax payments from farmers. Local officials oversaw the measurement and quality control of this grain before it was loaded onto riverboats for transport downstream to Alexandria. The Nile served as a natural highway connecting the agricultural heartland to the Mediterranean shipping hub, allowing for efficient movement of bulk cargoes. During the flooding season, specialized canals directed water to basins where it was held for irrigation, while also serving as transportation routes for grain-laden vessels heading toward the delta. Upon reaching Alexandria, the grain was transferred to storage facilities near the harbor, massive granaries, horea in Latin, capable of holding hundreds of thousands of tons of wheat. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that these granaries were sophisticated structures designed to protect the precious cargo from moisture, pests, and theft. Some featured raised floors to prevent ground moisture from reaching the grain, ventilation systems to regulate temperature and humidity, and compartmentalized storage areas to separate different shipments or qualities of grain. The management of these facilities required specialized knowledge and careful record keeping, with officials tracking exactly how much grain entered and left the system. The loading of grain onto the sea-going vessels bound for Rome represented a logistical challenge of considerable magnitude. Workers would transfer the wheat from the granaries to the harbor using a combination of human porters, animal transport, and possibly mechanical devices like chutes or primitive conveyor systems. The grain was typically carried in sacks to protect it during the transfer process, then either emptied directly into a ship's hold or stored in the sacks for the sea journey. Loading a large grain freighter could take many days and require hundreds of workers operating in coordinated teams. The proper distribution of this heavy cargo throughout the ship's hold was critical to maintaining stability at sea. A poorly loaded grain ship might list dangerously or even capsize in rough conditions. The ships themselves were engineering marvels, among the largest vessels of the ancient world, designed specifically for carrying maximum cargo with minimal crew. Literary and archaeological evidence suggests that the typical grain freighter of the Roman imperial period could carry 1,000 to 3,000 tons of wheat, enormous capacity by ancient standards. These ships were substantially larger than most merchant vessels of their time, with lengths potentially exceeding 180 feet and beam widths of 45 feet or more. Their rounded hulls maximized cargo space, while their relatively shallow draft, despite the heavy loads, allowed them to enter harbors that might be inaccessible to deeper-keeled vessels. The construction of these massive grain ships required specialized shipyards, skilled labor, and enormous quantities of timber, resources that Alexandria and the broader Egyptian economy provided. The ships were typically built using the shell-first construction technique, where the outer hull planking was assembled first, with internal framing added subsequently for additional strength. This method allowed for the creation of the rounded hull forms, ideal for bulk cargo. Iron nails and bronze fittings secured the wooden components, while pitch and other waterproofing materials sealed the hull against leakage. The completed vessels represented major capital investments, whether owned by the Roman state directly or by wealthy private contractors working under imperial supervision. The sailing season for the grain fleet followed the predictable weather patterns of the Mediterranean. Ships would typically depart Alexandria in early spring, when winds and sea conditions began to favor the journey to Italy. The most direct route would take the heavily laden vessels north to Cyprus, then westward along the southern coast of Asia Minor, through the Greek islands, around the Peloponnese, up the Italian coast, and finally to Rome's port at Ostia. This journey of approximately 1,500 nautical miles might take anywhere from 3 weeks to 2 months, depending on weather conditions and the number of stops made along the way. The return journey to Alexandria, with empty ships riding high in the water, could be accomplished more quickly, allowing for multiple round trips during the sailing season, from April to October. The dangers facing these precious grain shipments were considerable. Mediterranean storms could damage or sink even the largest vessels, particularly when they were heavily laden with grain. Pirates, though suppressed during periods of strong Roman naval control, remained an occasional threat to merchant shipping. Mechanical failures, such as leaking hulls, broken steering mechanisms, or damaged rigging, could leave ships vulnerable to the elements or unable to make headway against contrary winds. Fire represented a particularly fearsome danger aboard wooden ships carrying dry grain, with a small galley flame, or even spontaneous combustion in improperly dried cargo, potentially leading to catastrophic blazes that could consume an entire vessel in hours. Given these risks and the vital importance of the grain supply to Rome's stability, the imperial administration developed extensive protections for the Alexandrian grain fleet. Naval escorts often accompanied these valuable shipments, particularly in periods of heightened piracy or during conflicts that might bring enemy warships into Mediterranean waters. Specialized lighthouse systems and harbor improvements along the shipping route helped reduce navigational hazards. Legal privileges and financial incentives encouraged shipowners and captains to participate in this essential but dangerous trade. For instance, shipowners who committed their vessels to the grain trade for a specified period received certain tax exemptions and legal protections, while ship captains might be granted Roman citizenship after years of faithful service in this critical supply line. The arrival of the grain ships at Ostia, Rome's principal port, initiated another complex logistical operation. The wheat needed to be unloaded, inspected, measured, and transported up the Tiber River to the city itself. During the early imperial period, Ostia's harbor facilities were significantly expanded to accommodate the massive grain freighters. Emperor Claudius constructed a new harbor at Portus, just north of Ostia, with specialized facilities for the grain trade, including deep-water basins where the largest ships could dock safely. Emperor Trajan further improved this complex, with an enormous hexagonal inner harbor that provided additional protected docking space. These imperial investments in port infrastructure demonstrate the absolute priority placed on maintaining the smooth flow of Egyptian grain to the capital. Once the grain reached Rome, it entered the annona system, the state-managed program for distributing subsidized or free grain to eligible citizens. This system, which evolved over centuries of Roman history, became increasingly elaborate during the imperial period. By the time of Augustus, approximately 200,000 male citizens of Rome received a monthly grain ration, with the number of recipients and the specific distribution mechanisms changing under successive emperors. The annona represented one of the ancient world's largest public welfare programs, and it depended fundamentally on the reliable arrival of Egyptian grain through Alexandria's harbors. The political importance of this grain connection can hardly be overstated. The famous Roman phrase, bread and circuses, panem et circenses, acknowledged that keeping the urban population fed was essential to maintaining social order and political stability. Emperors who failed to ensure a steady grain supply faced potential riots or even revolts. This reality gave Egypt unique strategic significance within the Roman Empire. Unlike most provinces, which were administered by senators serving as governors, Egypt was placed under the direct control of a prefect appointed by and answerable to the emperor alone. High-ranking Romans were actually forbidden to visit Egypt without imperial permission, a restriction that reflected the emperor's concern that anyone who controlled Egypt's grain supply might use it as leverage to launch a bid for power. Alexandria's role as the export hub for this vital commodity gave the city exceptional importance within the Roman imperial system. The grain trade created thousands of jobs for Alexandrians, from the administrators who managed the granaries to the dockworkers who loaded the ships, from the shipwrights who built and repaired the massive freighters to the sailors who crewed them. The constant flow of Roman officials, merchants and sailors connected to the grain trade helped maintain Alexandria's cosmopolitan character and cultural significance even after it had lost its political independence following Cleopatra's defeat. The city's prosperity remained intimately tied to its function as the crucial link between Egypt's agricultural abundance and Rome's seemingly insatiable hunger. The Alexandrian grain fleet also facilitated cultural and intellectual exchanges between Egypt and Rome. Ships carrying wheat to Italy often returned with passengers, mail, luxury goods, and ideas. News, philosophical concepts, religious practices, and artistic styles moved along the same maritime routes as the grain shipments. Many of the distinctive syncretic elements of Roman-era Alexandria, where Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and other cultural traditions blended in unique ways, were nourished by these regular connections to the imperial capital. The sailors and merchants who traveled repeatedly between the two cities served as cross-cultural intermediaries, bringing Roman influences to Alexandria and Egyptian elements back to Italy. The system of grain shipments from Alexandria to Rome proved remarkably durable, continuing with modifications for centuries. Even after Constantinople became the eastern capital in the 4th century CE, Egyptian grain continued flowing to Rome, while also supplying the new imperial center on the Bosphorus. The Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE finally severed this ancient connection, forcing Rome to rely entirely on North African and other sources for its diminished but still substantial grain needs. The disruption of this vital supply line contributed significantly to Rome's demographic contraction and economic challenges during the early medieval period. For modern visitors to Alexandria, little visible evidence remains of this massive grain operation that once defined the city's relationship with Rome. The ancient granaries have long since disappeared beneath later construction or subsided beneath the waters of the rising Mediterranean. The specialized harbor installations for the grain trade now lie underwater or have been built over by modern port facilities. Yet the legacy of this vital connection lives on in historical accounts, in the archaeological record, and in our understanding of how this remarkable ancient city served as the linchpin in feeding one of history's greatest capitals. The grain ships that once departed Alexandria's harbors bound for Rome represent one of the most consequential maritime trade relationships of the ancient world, a vital artery connecting the heart of an empire to its most precious food source. The tranquil waters surrounding Alexandria have not always been peaceful. Throughout its long history, This strategic harbor has witnessed naval conflicts that changed the course of Mediterranean history, from Ptolemaic power struggles to Roman civil wars and beyond. As we continue our gentle journey through Alexandria's maritime past, let's explore the dramatic naval battles fought in these waters, examining how the city's exceptional harbor facilities made it both a prize worth fighting for and a base from which to project naval power. These conflicts, though violent, reveal much about the strategic importance of Alexandria and its central role in the political and military calculations of ancient powers. Perhaps the earliest significant naval engagement near Alexandria occurred during the Wars of the Diadochi, the conflict between Alexander the Great's successors following his death in 323 BCE. Ptolemy Soter, who had secured Egypt as his territory, faced challenges from rival generals seeking to reunify Alexander's empire. In 306 BCE, Demetrius Poliorcetes, son of Antigonus I, another of Alexander's generals, launched a naval attack on Ptolemy's forces near Cyprus. Although not fought directly at Alexandria, this Battle of Salamis had profound implications for the city's security. Ptolemy suffered a crushing defeat, losing much of his fleet and temporarily ceding control of the eastern Mediterranean. This setback demonstrated Alexandria's vulnerability to naval threats and spurred Ptolemy to rebuild his maritime forces, eventually establishing the powerful Ptolemaic navy that would protect the city for generations. The strategic significance of Alexandria's harbors became particularly apparent during the Roman civil wars of the late Republic period. As Rome's internal conflicts spilled across the Mediterranean, Egypt and its capital became both a prize and a battlefield. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria pursuing his rival Pompey, who had fled there after the Battle of Pharsalus. What Caesar found instead was Pompey's severed head, presented as a gift by the young Ptolemy XIII, who had ordered the assassination, misjudging what Caesar's reaction would be. Rather than gratitude, Caesar's response was outrage, and he soon found himself embroiled in the internal dynastic conflict between Ptolemy XIII and his sister co-ruler Cleopatra VII. This intervention precipitated the Alexandrian War, 48-47 BCE, a conflict that included significant naval dimensions, despite being primarily remembered for its land operations. Ptolemy XIII's forces trapped Caesar in the royal quarter adjacent to the Great Harbour, where the Roman commander had a limited force of approximately 4,000 men. Control of the harbour became crucial to both sides. For Caesar, it represented his only reliable link to potential reinforcements and supplies. For the Alexandrian forces, denying Caesar access to the sea was key to forcing his surrender or defeat. The most dramatic naval action of the Alexandrian War occurred when Ptolemy's supporters attempted to seize the control of the harbour by capturing or destroying the ships docked there. Caesar, recognizing the existential threat this posed to his position, ordered his troops to set fire to the enemy vessels. The flames spread beyond their intended targets, reportedly reaching some of the buildings near the waterfront, including warehouses that may have contained books from the famous Library of Alexandria. While the extent of the damage to the library remains debated by historians, this naval engagement had significant consequences for Alexandria's cultural heritage, as well as its immediate political situation. Caesar eventually prevailed with the arrival of reinforcements, and the battle for control of Alexandria's harbour demonstrated the city's strategic vulnerability despite its impressive defences. The Alexandrian War showed that whoever controlled the sea, approaches to the city held a significant advantage in any conflict for control of Egypt. This lesson would not be forgotten by future Roman leaders with designs on the wealthy kingdom. The next major naval conflict near Alexandria came during the final act of the Roman Republic's dissolution. After the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE, his former lieutenant Mark Antony and his heir Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, initially cooperated before their alliance deteriorated into open conflict. Antony established his base of operations in the eastern Mediterranean, forming both a political and romantic alliance with Cleopatra VII of Egypt. Alexandria became his de facto capital, and its harbour sheltered much of his naval power. The decisive confrontation between Antony and Octavian came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, fought off the coast of Greece rather than at Alexandria itself, but with profound implications for the Egyptian capital. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet, which included many vessels from Alexandria's naval contingent, was defeated by Octavian's forces led by his brilliant admiral Agrippa. The battle wasn't as one-sided as later Roman propaganda would claim. Antony had numerous large warships with experienced crews, and the outcome remained in doubt for some time. However, a series of tactical mistakes, possible betrayals by some of Antony's allies, and Agrippa's superior naval strategy led to a decisive victory for Octavian. Following this defeat, Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria with the remnants of their fleet. Octavian pursued them to Egypt the following year, 30 BCE, and Alexandria faced the prospect of another siege. However, no significant naval defense was mounted. The losses at Actium had been too severe, and many of Antony's remaining supporters abandoned him as Octavian's forces approached. Both Antony and Cleopatra chose suicide rather than capture, ending both the Ptolemaic dynasty and Alexandria's status as an independent capital. The city and its crucial harbors passed under Roman control, where they would remain for the next 6 centuries. During the Roman period, Alexandria's harbors were more often the base for projecting naval power than the site of battles themselves. The city served as headquarters for the Classis Alexandrina, Alexandrian fleet, one of Rome's permanent naval squadrons tasked with protecting the vital grain shipments to Italy and maintaining security in the eastern Mediterranean. This fleet included both warships for combat operations and specialized vessels for escort duties. The presence of this significant naval force made Alexandria less vulnerable to external threats, as potential enemies would need to overcome substantial Roman naval power to threaten the city from the sea. The strategic importance of Alexandria's harbor re-emerged during the crisis of the 3rd century, when the Roman Empire experienced multiple civil wars and temporary fragmentation. In 269–270 CE, the city became a focal point in the conflict between Emperor Aurelian and the breakaway Palmyrene Empire, led by Queen Zenobia, who had expanded her control from Syria into Egypt. Naval control was crucial in Aurelian's campaign to recover Egypt for the central Roman government. His forces secured the approaches to Alexandria, cutting off Zenobia's ability to reinforce or supply her garrison in the city. This naval advantage contributed significantly to Aurelian's success in bringing Egypt back under Roman control. Perhaps the most unusual naval conflict involving Alexandria occurred during the reign of Emperor Constantine, as part of his struggle against his rival Licinius for control of the Eastern Roman Empire. In 324 CE, Constantine's son Crispus led a fleet against Licinius's naval forces, commanded by Abantus. The initial engagement took place near the Hellespont Dardanelles, but the conflict extended into the eastern Mediterranean as Crispus pursued the retreating enemy fleet. Some historical accounts suggest that elements of this naval campaign reached as far as Alexandria, with skirmishes occurring near the harbor approaches as Constantine's forces secured control of Egypt. The outcome established Constantine as sole emperor and set the stage for Constantinople's emergence as the new eastern capital, a development that would eventually diminish Alexandria's relative importance in Mediterranean affairs. The Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE included a significant naval dimension that directly affected Alexandria. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of the Roman state, initially maintained naval superiority in the Mediterranean, allowing them to support Alexandria during the early Muslim advance. The city actually changed hands multiple times between 641 and 646 CE, with Byzantine naval forces able to recapture Alexandria temporarily after its initial fall to Arab forces under Amr ibn al-As. These operations demonstrated the continuing strategic value of Alexandria's harbor facilities, even as the city's overall importance had declined from its ancient heights. The most enduring naval legacy of these conflicts was the recognition by successive powers that controlling Alexandria meant controlling access to Egypt's enormous agricultural wealth and strategic position. This understanding influenced harbor defenses throughout the city's history. The Ptolemies invested heavily in both naval forces and harbor fortifications, including defensive towers at harbor entrances and chains that could be raised to block access during attacks. The Romans maintained and enhanced these defensive measures while incorporating Alexandria into their broader Mediterranean security system. Later Byzantine and Arab rulers similarly recognized the harbor's strategic significance, adjusting defensive arrangements to address evolving threats. Archaeological evidence of these naval conflicts is limited but tantalizing. Underwater investigations have recovered weapons, armor fragments, and structural elements that may relate to warships involved in these engagements. More substantially, the harbor fortifications modified after various conflicts provide physical testimony to the evolving strategic thinking about Alexandria's maritime security. The Catesby Fort, though built in the 15th century CE, stands on the site of the ancient Pharos lighthouse and incorporates some of its fallen stones, a physical link to the harbor defenses that protected Alexandria during numerous naval confrontations throughout its ancient history. What makes these naval battles particularly significant for understanding Alexandria is how they highlight the city's dual nature as both a commercial center and a strategic military prize. The same harbor facilities that welcomed merchant ships from across the Mediterranean also sheltered warships preparing for battle. The skilled shipwrights who built grain freighters for the vital trade with Rome could equally construct triremes and other naval vessels for war. The cosmopolitan population that made Alexandria a center of culture and learning also included naval architects, marine engineers, and sailors whose technical expertise could be directed toward either peaceful commerce or naval conflict as circumstances required. As we imagine these ancient naval battles, with opposing fleets maneuvering for advantage in the waters near Alexandria's harbors, we can appreciate how the city's maritime character shaped its historical experience. The ships that once fought in these waters, their bronze rams gleaming beneath the Mediterranean sun, their decks crowded with marines preparing for combat, their commanders calculating wind and current to gain tactical advantage, have long since disappeared. But the strategic significance of Alexandria's position, which made it worth fighting for across multiple centuries and civilizations, continues to influence its identity even in the modern era. The peaceful harbor we've explored throughout our journey has witnessed both the productive exchange of goods and ideas, and the violent clash of opposing powers, dual aspects of Alexandria's rich and complex maritime heritage.